Okay. The hearing will come to order. Okay. Put this down here. Let me, first of all, welcome all of our members to our first hearing. Let me welcome as well our witnesses and members of the public and members of the press. We're here this morning to examine U.S. policy in the Arabian Peninsula. Before I get to my views and recognize our ranking member, a bit of housekeeping. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. One of my goals as chairman of this committee will be to underscore the importance of American values as part of our foreign policy. When we're at our best, we put democracy, human rights, and the rule of order at the center of our conduct all over the world. It's the right thing to do. It's a reflection of our country's character, its compassion, its generosity. It also makes it easier to advance our interests and our security. It's with this idea in mind that I focused our first hearing on our policy in the Arabian Peninsula. This region has posed some of the most vexing problems for our top diplomats, and it is a top priority of this committee to help move our policy in the Gulf towards one that safeguards American interests while honoring American values. Our Gulf policy should not have to sacrifice one for the other. Since the start of the current Yemen conflict in 2015, more than 10,000 people have died in airstrikes, 85,000 children have died of malnutrition, 14 million Yemenites are on the brink of famine, and more than 1 million suffer from cholera. The UN calls this the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and there's no shortage of bad news. In just the last week, it was confirmed that silos holding 1/4 of Yemen's wheat stocks had been destroyed. And 8 more civilians were killed when a bomb struck a center for internally displaced people. Yemen was already in crisis before the conflict began, but the war has made things far worse. I want to be clear. Saudi Arabia and its partners have very real and urgent security challenges. The Houthis in Yemen receive support from Iran. The Houthis are launching missiles into Saudi territory, threatening Saudi civilians as well as American personnel. In 2016, they launched cruise missiles at a U.S. Navy ship in the Red Sea. And our country's strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia, despite some bumps in the road, have been a valuable one. Saudi Arabia plays an important role as a counterbalance to Iran in the region. But neither the threats facing the Saudis nor America's partnerships with the kingdom mean that the Saudis should have a blank check. We cannot look the other way when it comes to the recklessness with which the Saudi-led coalition has conducted its operations. In Yemen, I'm not just talking about one tragic screw-up, though that would be bad enough. The coalition's operations have been characterized by strike after strike after strike that has resulted in unnecessary civilian casualties. A school bus full of children, a wedding, a funeral, and these mistakes have been compounded by a lack of real accountability. At the same time, both the coalition and the Houthi authorities have prevented humanitarian assistance from getting to where it's needed most. So we need to stay focused on ending the suffering in Yemen and advancing a political solution. In the long term, I am hopeful about the UN peace process led by Special Envoy Martin Griffiths and where these negotiations can lead. The war in Yemen poses significant challenges, but we cannot view the issues in the Arabian Peninsula solely through that lens. Our relationship with the Saudis is very different now than it was even 6 months ago. The heinous murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi shocked the world, and the administration seemed content to sweep it under the rug and move on. That's not acceptable to me. In addition, new reporting suggests that the weapons the United States and the Saudis sold the Emiratis are now ending up in the hands of al-Qaeda terrorists, Houthi rebels, and Iranian intelligence officials as well. and of course the ongoing imprisonment of women activists, including Lujain al-Hathlul and Hatun al-Fassi, and other human rights abuses, cannot be ignored. So it can no longer be business as usual. We need to see a real change in Saudi behavior. We need to push for accountability. And we need to understand what has driven our own administration's policy in this part of the world. I want to assure everyone listening today that today's hearing and markup presents the beginning of this committee's focus on these issues. We will not sweep these questions under the rug, and we will push for changes that are absolutely necessary to get the U.S.-Saudi relationship back on track. I'm interested to hear from our witnesses about how to grapple with these challenges, but first I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Mike McCall of Texas, for any opening remarks he might have.
I'd like to thank my good friend, Mr. Engel, for calling this important hearing. The United States has key national security interest in the Arabian Peninsula, which is why we spent decades cultivating close partnerships with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. We've had a long history of working together to advance our shared strategic interests. Even so, each of these partnerships has its own nuances and complexities. We've often encouraged these partners to make improvements on areas such as human rights and religious freedom, such as through our annual State Department reports. We've also had long-standing concerns about terror financing and other support for terror emanating from the Gulf. We are grateful for the progress that has been made in recent years, although there's still much work to be done. And like many, I was heartened to hear about the reforms on the horizon in Saudi Arabia, such as lifting the ban on women driving. In the context of this hope for the kingdom's future, I was both appalled and deeply saddened by the news of Jamal Khashoggi's murder. Jamal's murder was a major setback in our relationship with Saudi Arabia, a gruesome and disturbing crime that sadly showed how much further the Saudis need to go. Nothing like this crime can happen again, and everybody responsible must be held accountable. This fall, we heard distressing reports that women's rights activists have been not only imprisoned but tortured. We need to see serious changes in the Saudis' behavior with respect to dissidents and expatriates to regain our trust. The lessons of this terrible event needs to be that intimidation and violence by any government against peaceful dissent will be met with strong disapproval by responsible nations. All of our witnesses have distinguished records of U.S. government service working on Middle Eastern issues. Amid daily reports about the fragility of the United Nations Special Envoy to Yemen's ongoing peace efforts, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what the United States can do to bring a sustainable political solution to the conflict that will help mitigate the urgent humanitarian crisis. Unfortunately, today's discussion of the Yemen war is complicated by the markup of what I believe to be an ill-advised bill. I will say more later, but I am alarmed that we are abusing a privileged war powers procedure to address questions where U.S. forces are not involved in combat. Not only does it fail to meaningfully address the security cooperation issues we face in the region, it also creates a dangerous precedent that could disrupt U.S. security cooperation with partners all around the world. With that said, the number of civilian deaths during this conflict is deeply concerning. Improvements in humanitarian access are critical to preventing the crisis from worsening. Every effort must be taken to eliminate civilian casualties from airstrikes. I hope this hearing will contribute to the conversation about what applicable and appropriate steps the United States can take to decrease the threat that this conflict poses to civilians rather than adding fuel to the fire of an unproductive conversation about war powers. I fear that many of the recent discussions regarding the Yemen conflict have obscured the incredibly damaging role that the Houthis are playing. Recent reports have documented the Houthis' diversion of vital food aid from people in need and the brutal torture of detainees. Iran is also playing an incredibly harmful role in this conflict by supplying the Houthis with ballistic missiles and other forms of support. The UN itself has reported that Iran has violated UN Security Council resolutions through their support for the Houthis. I hope our witnesses today will discuss how the United States and our partners can effectively respond to Iran's role in this conflict. We can also not lose sight of the fact that significant terrorist threats continue to emanate out of Yemen. Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates testified last week that al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen, AQAP, remains one of the largest and most capable terrorist groups in the world. We are grateful to our Gulf partners for their help in countering this threat. I dealt with AQAP and their external operations for many years as chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and I hope our witnesses can speak to whether our current counterterrorism strategy in Yemen is as effective as it could be, or whether any changes need to be made. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. It's now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses today. Mr. David Hardin, Managing Director of the Georgetown Strategy Group. Mr. Hardin previously served as Assistant USAID Administrator in the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, as well as numerous other roles across nearly 2 decades at USAID, including directing USAID's operation in Yemen until last year. Dr. Mara Carlin, the Director of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. Dr. Carlin has served in national security roles for 5 Secretaries of Defense, most recently as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. Mr. Jake Sullivan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Sullivan was National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden and also the Director of Policy Planning and Deputy Chief of Staff at the Department of State. And Mr. Mike Singh, Managing Director of the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy. He was Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the White House from 2007 to 2008, and a Director on the NSC staff from 2005 to 2007. Earlier, he served as Special Assistant to Secretaries of State Powell and Rice, and at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. This is a distinguished panel, and we're delighted to have them with us this morning. Thank you very much. I'd like to say for the record that we invited administration witnesses to be part of this discussion, but we were told that the relevant State Department officials were traveling this week. So we hope to hear from them soon in the future. Our witnesses' testimony will be included in the record of this hearing, and I'd now like to recognize our witnesses for 5 minutes each, and we'll start with Mr. Hardin.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and the distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for having me today. Last night, I just got back from the Middle East. I was in Tel Aviv, Ramallah, Amman, Riyadh, Dammam, and Abu Dhabi. So I hope that I have some fresh perspectives to bring. My perspective is typically very much focused on the economics and the humanitarian angles. I will begin with Yemen, but I want to take a moment to also look at the broader issues that the Arabian Peninsula will face in the coming decade, and then I offer one big idea for this committee. On Yemen, Chairman Engel set out the horrific statistics. The tragedy is overwhelming. The challenge is, though, is that the political process, political accommodation, is not likely to succeed in the short term. We have great respect for the UN envoy, but the Stockholm Agreement is fragile, reversible, and likely not to hold. There's likely an attack on Hodeidah sometime this year. There is no military solution. And so within this context, I offer a very bleak short-term assessment of Yemen. It's hard to figure out a way forward. I offer, humbly, an economic set of policies which are very detailed and are in my statement, and I'm happy to answer questions about those during the hearing. But fundamentally, the only mechanisms that we have available to us right now are to increase the purchasing power at the household level for families. We can do this by improving access and allowing greater, more robust trade to come in from every direction. Humanitarian assistance is 5% of the total basic commodities that come into Yemen. 95% of it is private sector trade. Nothing will work unless more trade, more basic commodities come in faster and at cheaper prices. Secondly, the currency needs to be stabilized. The currency collapse as a result of the splintering of the bank has been the single driving force for the humanitarian collapse. Thirdly, more revenue, more income has to come into individuals, into households, and that means paying salaries for teachers, sanitation workers, and healthcare providers. If we can get the economics right, then there is a prospect for creating a bit of a space to push forward political process and political accommodation. The economics alone won't work. It's not sufficient. We also need a stabilization strategy, and at the moment there isn't one. We have to, and when I say we, I mean the international community, together, collectively. We have to envision a strategy that will give some hope to the people, address underlying grievances, provide basic services and jobs and economic opportunity. Then, if we get it right, there could be some opportunity forward. But the tragedy of Yemen will stay with us longer than what we can bear. What worries me, though, is within the context of Yemen and its exhaustive state, as well as what's happening in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, I deeply worry that the United States may turn its back on the Middle East. And we do so at our own risk. There is a rising tide of neo-isolationism. The opportunities and the broad trends that are facing the Arabian Peninsula over the next decade are both exciting and represent inflection points. So clearly we know and we see that there is a new great game in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Horn of Africa, where China and Iran and Turkey and Russia are seeking influence, markets, and power. Secondly, we know that there will be rapid and impressive technological changes and changes to capital structures and capital flows. The United States may be a part of this, but we also may not be the leader in this. And then lastly, it's important not to discount the rising aspirations of the Gulf states. There's the Saudi 2030 vision, of course. The UAE is setting forth a 50-year plan in just a couple of years. These rising aspirations provide both opportunity and risks for us. So with that, how do we manage? How do we go forward? How do we get out of this Middle East purgatory? So I proposed in my statement to you a crisis response core that would allow us to more effectively, with 21st century technology, agility, capabilities, to bring talent to the most complex crises and achieve our overriding goals of a secure Arabian Peninsula and advancing American security, economic, and political interests. I turn it back to you, Chairman. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Harlan. Dr. Carlin.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. This morning, I will summarize my written remarks, which I submit for the record. Having examined the Middle East as a national security policymaker and as a scholar for nearly 2 decades, I can confidently say this is a critical time to assess it. Regional challenges are growing thornier, and the opportunity costs of U.S. involvement are deepening. While we cannot fully extricate from this region, we must recognize it is less of a priority than it once was, particularly in contrast to Asia and Europe, which must command more of our attention. As U.S. policy currently stands, the United States exists in a kind of purgatory. We are too distracted by regional crises to pivot to other global priorities, but we're not invested enough to move the region in a better direction. This worst of both worlds approach exacts a heavy price, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula. Simply put, today we should focus on how and in what ways the United States can pursue a more realistic and sustainable approach toward the region, not whether we should do so. This rethinking is long overdue. Looking ahead, U.S. policy in the Arabian Peninsula must acknowledge and respond to 3 key dilemmas. First, how to ruthlessly prioritize despite terrorism's pull. Recommendations for a new U.S. approach are often binary. The maximalist version ignores the rockiness of U.S. efforts to date in places like Iraq and Libya and dismisses how challenging it would be to sustain domestic political support for the large long-term investments that fundamentally altering this permissive environment for terrorism and chaos would require. The minimalist version ignores the comparative advantage that America's global role has afforded it and underestimates just how dangerous the power vacuum could be should Washington withdraw from the region. It is foolhardy to believe we can or should pursue either approach without substantial costs in blood, treasure, and time. In the Arabian Peninsula, the United States should focus on 3 key issues: protecting freedom of navigation in the region's major maritime passages, preventing oil producers or troublemakers from destabilizing the flow of oil, and containing actors hostile to Washington, including terrorists. While terrorism remains a very real challenge, the United States must approach it in a smarter and more sustainable way. We must set clear guidelines about when and we will use force. The second dilemma, how do we recognize our friends' value, but also our flaws? Allies and partners are the United States' comparative global advantage. The U.S. military will always fight alongside allies and partners. Yet some will be more capable than others. We will perennially face an expectations mismatch between our needs and capabilities and theirs. Transforming self-interested and short-sighted regional partners into reliable long-term allies is wishful thinking, at least not without incurring enormous costs and long-term commitments. Therefore, we must rethink how we work with regional partners. We should not just focus on the promise and ignore the peril of outsourcing U.S. military campaigns, especially in the Arabian Peninsula, where our partners come with overwhelming funding and complicated politics. This model of by, with, and through that the U.S. military likes to discuss works only if we recognize this cooperation is a political, not technical exercise, and if the partners on the ground share our priorities. Success requires setting realistic goals, clearly and actively communicating our expectations to our partners, and constantly assessing how well they are meeting the objectives we seek. While we cannot control everything our regional partners do, we can control where we set our own limits in the relationship and the support that we provide. And the third dilemma is how do we recalibrate U.S. resources despite the U.S. military's predominance in this region? Since the September 11th attacks, our approach to this region has been overwhelmingly driven by military tools. Given the nature of regional threats and the broader security environment, this approach is both costly and increasingly ineffective. We must fully adjudicate thorny trade-offs in this region. And today, on key questions of U.S. policy toward the region, different parts of the interagency are completely out of sync. Our military, diplomatic, and economic tools are often giving different messages. That's bad for U.S. interests. Most of this region's challenges will not be fundamentally solved by military tools, but through active diplomacy and political agreements. Executing a nuanced and effective approach requires substantial and capable staff who have meaningful regional expertise. But right now, the U.S. approach is too much sword and too little pen. We must recognize there's no such thing as a purely operational military presence in the Middle East. And let me just wrap up with a few key points. One, Iranian bad behavior in this region is a serious problem. 2, while a Gulf security architecture to counter Iran would be helpful, mutual hatreds and long-simmering tensions over regional competition make it unlikely to emerge. And third, the astrategic and ineptly executed Emirati and Saudi military campaign in Yemen has only benefited Tehran. There is little evidence that U.S. support to these militaries as they wage their war in Yemen has made their execution of this conflict meaningfully more effective. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you to talk about these important subjects, and especially to appear alongside such talented colleagues on this panel. And at the outset, I'd like to make 3 points to help frame the discussion. First, Congress can and must take action to end U.S. support for the war in Yemen and help pave the way for a diplomatic solution. The Obama administration's initial support for the Saudi-led coalition ultimately turned into the blank check of current policy, and the moral and human costs are staggering, as both the chairman and the ranking member pointed out in their comments. U.S. assistance and U.S. policy today is contributing to the continuation of what is now the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Now, to be clear, the Saudi-led coalition does not bear all of the responsibility for the violence and suffering in Yemen. The Houthis have chosen war over diplomacy too, and they have immense blood on their hands. And Iran continues to provide them material support and cheerleading. But as Dr. Carlin just said, when it comes to countering the Iranian threat, our current approach has done nothing but make things worse. It has strengthened the Houthis, and it has aided Iran. It has also empowered extremist groups, including some who are now in possession of U.S. weapons and technologies. The right approach for the United States is to put pressure on the coalition to curtail its military activities, including by withdrawing U.S. military assistance, while increasing constructive efforts to reduce Iran's support for the Houthis. Recent congressional pressure has helped rein in some of the worst instincts of our partners, opening space for diplomatic negotiations that could build on the Stockholm Agreement. But Congress should not stop there. I believe the War Powers Resolution that passed the Senate last year is worthy of support, and that Congress should send that resolution to the President's desk, and I look forward to discussing that with the committee today. I also commend legislative proposals to prohibit logistical support and the sale and transfer of offensive weapons. The goal should be to end U.S. assistance for this campaign while encouraging the administration to take a more active role in diplomacy to reach a political solution to the conflict. Second, Congress should reinforce its commitment to defending the territorial integrity of regional partners in the face of persistent threats from state and non-state actors. Iran is continuing to provide assistance to the Houthis, as the ranking member said, to help them attack Red Sea shipping, as well as firing missiles at land-based targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. An end to offensive support for the war in Yemen should be accompanied by an increase in tailored defensive support for our partners to counter these threats. This could include increased maritime patrols on the Saudi Red Sea coast and a renewed push to install more sophisticated missile defense systems in the Gulf. More broadly, Congress should hold the administration accountable for failing to produce a coherent Iran strategy that actually ties available means to realistic objectives. I hope we can discuss that more today. Third, this hearing should mark the start of a serious bipartisan strategic review of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Too often in Washington, talk of Saudi Arabia, the issue of Saudi Arabia, centers around a cartoonish binary: unconditional support or throwing the relationship away. This is both a silly and counterproductive way to approach a complex partnership in a complex time. If any good can come in the aftermath of the shocking murder of Jamal Khashoggi, it should be a serious conversation about how we establish a sustainable relationship between our two countries that advances shared interests while accounting for, rather than ignoring or wishing away, actions that undermine those interests and run contrary to our values. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia do still share interests, including in countering terrorism and in countering Iran. But for the U.S., that cannot mean blind deference to the judgment of regional partners. That approach has only empowered the leaders in Tehran while undermining American values. There is a better way. Instead of continuing to support a strategically disastrous war in Yemen, the United States should be prioritizing healing the rift in the Gulf Cooperation Council, considering how to put pressure on Iranian maritime shipments in support to the Houthis, pushing for theater missile defense arrangements, and exercises influence in Iraq, Lebanon, and Qatar, where there are natural constituencies for American support. At the same time, the U.S. should elevate the priority of reform and human rights in the relationship with Saudi Arabia, especially in light of the recent repressive actions and trends that we heard about at the outset of this hearing. All of this, in addition to the continuing need for accountability with respect to the Khashoggi murder, leads to the inexorable conclusion, as you said, Mr. Chairman, that it cannot be business as usual in this relationship. Thank you again for inviting me here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee. I appreciate the invitation to speak before you, and it's an honor to appear at your first hearing leading this committee. The U.S. is undergoing a strategic shift in the world, from a grand strategy focused on counterterrorism to one that's focused on great power competition, and I think there's broad bipartisan agreement that this is the right trajectory for the United States. What's less clear, though, I think, is what this implies, what this means for America's strategy in the Middle East. Some have suggested it means basically shifting our resources away from this region and trying to disentangle ourselves from it. I think there's two big problems, though, with this concept, with this idea. One is that we still have very important interests in this region. Counterterrorism is one of them, non-proliferation is another, and the list goes on. Second is that the Middle East itself is, and always has been, frankly, vital to great power competition. For example, our Asian allies, as well as China, are highly dependent on the energy resources coming from this region, even if we're not. So the key question in my mind is, how do we continue to secure our interests in the region and prevent inroads by our rivals while reallocating our resources elsewhere? The clearest way to do this, I think, is to work as much as possible through allies. Of course, this is easy to say, and it's much harder in practice, as some of my colleagues have noted. Just stepping back a bit, since the regional turmoil that broke out in this region in 2011, and since the U.S. has started to, let's say, sort of disengage a bit strategically, we've seen a complex dynamic emerge in the region. You've got three ad hoc blocks of powers in this region which are jockeying against one another for preeminence. You've got a sort of block of conservative powers, the Saudis, the Emiratis, tacitly joined by Israel, and in an interesting way, the center of gravity in the Arab world has really shifted in their direction. You've got a more Islamist-oriented bloc consisting of Turkey and Qatar, and they often work together. And then you've got a bloc that's hostile to the United States, consisting of Iran and its partners, Syria, and various proxies like Hezbollah. This rivalry, this three-way rivalry, combined with the phenomenon of state actors moving into the region's security and governance vacuums, has prompted an unprecedented burst of regional interventionism. This isn't just Saudi Arabia and the UAE intervening in Yemen. It's the UAE and Qatar in Libya, the UAE and Turkey across the Horn of Africa, Iran intervening in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and so forth. The list goes on, frankly. And those results, far from advancing our interests, have contributed to instability and have set back our interests. So if we're going to harness our allies' growing capabilities, their willingness to take the initiative, we're going to need to overcome a lot of obstacles. And I agree, I think, with many of my colleagues about those obstacles. It's their limited military effectiveness, it's the poor coordination and the disputes we've seen among our allies, their human rights deficiencies. I think this is most egregious in the case of the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, but frankly, these problems are endemic to the region. It's the economic problems facing our allies, and frankly, our Gulf partners all face a common set of economic problems. And it's the role of spoilers like Iran and the increasing inroads being made by external powers like Russia and China. And in my written testimony, I go into detail about these and some proposed solutions for overcoming them. But on a couple of specific topics which you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Ranking Member McCall, raised, on the topic of suspending or placing conditions on arms sales or security assistance. Look, in my view, having worked on security assistance, it should always begin with a common conception of our shared interests and a shared strategy for tackling a particular problem. In the case of a conflict, our support should be forthcoming only if we think our partners have realistic objectives and a realistic timetable for accomplishing them. Conditionality should be built in up front in the initial conversations. It shouldn't just be something imposed by Congress. I think, frankly, we should also expect our partners to follow international norms of warfare. But even as we promote human rights, promote reforms, I think we need to be careful about tying these issues together. Because, frankly, I think doing so has a poor track record. I think that our partners tend to resent the imposition. And I think, frankly, our aid is often insufficient leverage to accomplish the goals that we set for it. I think it's better to avoid that temptation of tying everything together, but I think we need to accept that we'll work on those issues separately. Some will see faster progress, some will see slower progress. In Yemen, I think we need to bear in mind two big picture points in Yemen. First, this is not primarily a Saudi-Iranian conflict in Yemen. It has its roots in the disintegration of the Saleh regime in 2011 and the ousting of the legitimate transitional government by the Houthis. Second, withdrawing our military support is not going to end the war or ease the problems that Yemen is experiencing. There are multiple conflicts in Yemen. The Houthis against the coalition, there's a north-south conflict, there's the conflict with AQAP and ISIS, and so forth, and all of those will go on if we withdraw. So rather than walking away from our partners, I think it's important that we work with them to craft a strategy for the next phase of this war, which I think we and they believe should primarily be a political phase of the conflict. This means, I think, first and foremost, supporting the UN-led mediation, hopefully building on it. And I think if those talks falter, as they may, it means narrowing the scope of the conflict to what really matters most, and that's improving humanitarian access, countering Iranian proliferation, and deterring missile and rocket attacks. A third point, we need to reinvigorate our diplomacy in the region. In too many Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, you have too many issues in the hands of too few officials, and that creates a fragility in the relationship, I think. We need to use our influence not just to shape the Saudis' behavior, but to expand the number of points of contact, especially at the working level. But encouraging our partners, frankly, to delegate, I think, means practicing this discipline ourselves. And so we need to get officials into place in Saudi Arabia and in Middle East policymaking positions at state and DOD. And just a final point, even as we seek to work through allies, which I think we'll do more and more in this region and maybe others, we can't forget that U.S. leadership remains indispensable in this region. There are certain things that we can do that our allies can't. For example, building international coalitions to counter ISIS or to counter Iran's problematic behavior. We bring unique capabilities to the table, especially when it comes to countering some emerging threats like cyber threats, maritime threats, and missile threats. And to me, our forward deployed presence is an essential stabilizing factor in the region. I'm a little bit concerned about the talk that we hear now about bringing the troops home, because a lot of our deployments in the region are sustainable, they're low cost, and frankly, if we depart, especially with Russia and China coming in, especially with A2AD technology spreading, getting back in, I think, will be much more difficult. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for some questions. Earlier this week, CNN reported that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have transferred U.S. weapons to al-Qaeda-linked extremist groups fighting in Yemen. The report also said that American weapons are being used by the Houthi rebels, which means they have probably also been in the hands of the Iranians. These reports are very troubling, and the Trump administration must investigate further and work to prevent this from happening again. In light of these allegations, should Congress pursue greater restrictions on offensive weapons to the Saudi coalition? What benchmarks should they be required to meet before sales and transfers can continue? Let me start with you, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was equally troubled by these reports, which indicate that sophisticated American weaponry is now finding its way into the hands of al-Qaeda-linked extremists, as well as the point you made, which is that Iranian intelligence operatives now have the chance to take some of this weaponry and material, pull it apart, and learn quite a bit about their adversary, the United States' capabilities and capacities. And this underscores the risk of continuing to provide offensive military capabilities to a coalition that is using them in disregard of human rights and civilian casualties, but is also using them in disregard of effective military action, including cutting all kinds of deals with al-Qaeda-linked extremists throughout the country, some to get them to fight with the coalition, some to pay them off to just go back into the countryside with all of these weapons and the money to boot to only build up more strength to potentially threaten the United States and its partners. And so my bottom line view in answer to your question, Mr. Chairman, is that the time has come for the United States to cease providing offensive weapons for purposes of use in Yemen altogether.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Hardin, let me ask you this. In a post-conflict scenario, which is hard to imagine at this point, what should be the responsibility of the Saudi coalition in rebuilding critical infrastructure in Yemen? What message should the United States be sending to ensure that that planning starts now?
Well, I think for sure the Saudis need to be one of the lead donors and forces in the reconstruction of a post-conflict Yemen. I don't think it should be limited to just the Saudis. I think the UAE and the rest of the Gulf states should contribute, but overwhelmingly it should be the Saudis. One additional point I would just add is that rebuilding alone isn't enough. The trading opportunities that Yemen would have with Saudi and high-end markets are very important, and I would encourage the Saudis to look at that as a means of both helping to provide economic opportunity to Yemen and integrating it into the world economy better. Thank you.
Let me ask Dr. Carlin and Mr. Singh if they care to comment on any of the questions I asked Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Hardin.
I'd just like to add a little bit to that first question on the possible movement of U.S. materiel to unsavory actors. The U.S. military has an extremely rigorous end-use monitoring system. So whenever material is given to our partners and allies around the world, it is incumbent on them to keep a close eye on where it is, and U.S. embassy officials regularly will go and check to confirm that material is where it is supposed to be. This is probably among the most worrisome things I've heard in our cooperation with these militaries, and that's a pretty high bar, given some of the things we've been discussing so far. Of all things that would make me consider an immediate halting of our cooperation, this is actually on the top of the list. If we can't trust that the sophisticated material we give our partners and allies sticks with them, then I think we actually need to rethink the entire relationship. If I were in your position, I would call on a serious investigation by the Pentagon of what happened here and what went wrong and who will be held responsible, both on the U.S. government side and with our partners.
Thank you, Mr. Singh.
Well, I agree. I would say that from my point of view, end-use monitoring, end-use verification, this is always very difficult in these types of conflict situations. We saw similar phenomena in Syria and in Iraq where weapons ended up in the hands of ISIS, oftentimes because they were dropped on the battlefield by our partners. I do think that the right response is not to say, well, let's cut off all assistance as a result. I think the right response is to look more carefully into these reports, find out what's happening, why it's happening, and so forth, and then act appropriately. Work with our partners, if necessary, to improve end-use verification.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of look at this as a sort of geopolitical interest, tricky area of the world, for sure. But I see Iran, I see Saudi, I see Yemen, I see Israel. Iran is in Yemen. Mr. Singh, can you tell us what Iran is doing in Yemen and why are they supporting the Houthis?
Thank you. From what I have seen, the Iranians have provided materiel to the Houthis. And it's possible they've also provided some level of, say, training and even operational assistance for the systems they provide the Houthis. So, for example, the rockets and missiles that are fired into Saudi Arabia, the missiles that have been fired in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait that have endangered international shipping and the U.S. Navy, we suspect a lot of that traces back to Iran. Why is Iran doing this? I think Iran has a national security strategy in the region which focuses on keeping potential adversaries destabilized. I think Iran wants to see instability on the border of Saudi Arabia so that Saudi Arabia has to focus south and not focus on Iran proper. It's the same concept that Iran follows in Lebanon, keeping pressure on Israel's northern border as a sort of tool to use leverage against Israel. That's why I think that, frankly, the Iranians probably don't have much interest in the resolution of this conflict in Yemen.
So they are supporting the Houthis, I guess, presumably against the Saudis. Does this affect Israel in any way?
I think the Israelis, as well as our other allies in the region, are very concerned about Iran's cultivation of proxies across the region. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, they're trying to do it in Bahrain and probably trying to do it elsewhere as well. Because what we've seen is that there's a sort of transfer of knowledge, equipment, funding, and so forth between these proxies. Hezbollah has boasted about assisting the Houthis. Hezbollah is active in Iraq. We've seen Bahraini Shia extremists go and participate in Iraqi Shia militias and so forth. So it's that network of Iranian proxies across the region, the transfer of weaponry, technology, funding, and so forth that's concerning to all of our allies in the region.
Okay. So in my briefings, and I had one just yesterday, our involvement in the region is not one of engaging in hostilities against the Houthis, but rather a counterterrorism mission against AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and ISIS. I was chairman of Homeland Security for 6 years. Every time we got an external plot threat briefing in the classified space, it was always coming out of AQAP, wanting to hit airliners, bring down airplanes. Can you tell us, and DNI Coates just testified, that AQAP remains one of the largest and most capable terrorist groups globally. In your assessment, is our mission limited to counterterrorism in Yemen and not a broader, as some would say, against the Houthis? Is that a righteous mission for us to be there?
Oh, absolutely, Congressman. I think that America's direct involvement in Yemen is limited to our actions against AQAP and other affiliated groups. That mission has continued throughout this conflict, which has obviously posed big challenges for that mission. But if you look at the record over the past year, 2 years, in fact, I think we've made some strides in that mission against AQAP, but it remains a very serious threat. I think most of our CT personnel agree on that.
So I would, to my colleagues, I would say, as we debate this resolution, that we have no involvement, we have no active engagement of hostilities in Yemen from a military standpoint. Our only presence in Yemen is a counterterrorism presence against AQAP, Al-Qaeda, under a 2001 authorized use of military force that was authorized after 9/11 to go after Al-Qaeda. And we have a humanitarian assistance presence. There is no presence in Yemen to actively engage in hostilities against the Houthis. Would you agree with that, Mr. Singh?
I would agree with it. I think that the types of assistance we're giving to the Saudi-led coalition, whether it's intelligence sharing, mid-air refueling, which obviously we're not doing anymore, to me, these would not constitute engaging in the hostilities. And if we were to consider them that, it would set, I think, a pretty difficult precedent for our actions around the world.
Thank you, sir. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. I'm going to ask him to take the chair for a few minutes.
American national security starts with non-proliferation. The new Crown Prince MBS has said that he wants a nuclear program for Saudi Arabia, and has hinted that the reason is so that he can have the same or better nuclear capacity than Iran when it comes to weapons. The least expensive way to generate electricity most of the time is to burn natural gas when the natural gas is very cheap. There's a lot of natural gas on the Arabian Peninsula where it's inexpensive, or you can go through the highly expensive cost of liquefying it and exporting it. So the question here is the Saudi nuclear program being created because it's some efficient way to generate electricity, or is it being created for the purpose of giving Saudi Arabia an opportunity to learn the nuclear technology and develop the systems necessary so that they could choose to move forward with a nuclear weapon? Does anybody have a response? Mr. Sullivan.
Congressman, it is a matter of U.S. national security that we work against nuclear proliferation across the Middle East, starting with blocking Iran's attempts to seek a nuclear weapon, but very much focused on working with our partners in the Gulf to choose alternatives to trying to develop an indigenous enrichment capacity. We have signed a 1-2-3 agreement with the UAE, for example, in which the supply of nuclear technology comes from the outside, so there's no proliferation risk.
Thank you. I'd point out that Saudi Arabia is resisting signing the same kind of protection and limitation agreement that UAE signed, and that they are the only reason for them not to agree to standards designed to prevent them from having a nuclear weapon. It's because they want the capacity to have a nuclear weapon. We may differ on what our policy should be in Yemen, but at a minimum, I don't see how we can cooperate with Saudi Arabia on Yemen or many other things until they agree not to develop nuclear weapons, and that any nuclear program they have would be subject to the same gold standard that Mr. Sullivan provides. The Washington Post cited satellite imagery indicating that Saudi Arabia has secretly built a ballistic missile production factory. Do any of you have any information as to which country is helping them build that factory? I'm not sure any of you would. I'll move on to the next question. Yemen poses a great moral quandary for us because terrible things are going to happen next year and the year after and this year in Yemen. And the question morally for us is, are we morally pure if we can at least say we're not involved? Saudi Arabia has air power. Whoever uses air power is subject to a lot of attacks in the press because when it goes wrong, it's obvious and it's big. The Houthis have small arms. What they do may be just as deadly. Their use of child soldiers, their stealing of aid payments and food have been well documented. But the Saudis use bombing, and they're occasionally, perhaps more than occasionally, going to hit civilian targets. So I think we're in a situation, but if we don't help them, they're still going to bomb. They just may be more inaccurate. So which is the more morally pure position for the United States? To help Saudi Arabia with its bombing program, knowing that even with our help, they're going to hit 2 school buses this year, or to wash our hands of the program, knowing that they're going to keep bombing, and then without our help, they're going to hit 4 school buses this year. So the question for the panel is, would cutting off targeting assistance, and that's the focus of the question, targeting assistance to Saudi Arabia, cause them to reduce their bombing, or would they simply reduce the accuracy of the same number of sorties? Mr. Harden.
I think the United States needs to remain engaged in Yemen, and it's hard to disaggregate between the military component of it and the humanitarian.
I'm just focusing
I
on,
understand
I've got
that.
very limited time.
Right. So if we're not involved, we're not going to have influence, and we're not going to be able to affect the outcome in a way that would be constructive for the Yemeni people.
Does anybody have a very quick answer. Would the Saudis reduce their bombing or just reduce the accuracy?
Where's the evidence that the U.S. support for targeting assistance over the last few years has meaningfully helped the situation?
We can't count the buses that haven't been hit, and we don't know. We simply don't know. But my time has expired, and I'll move on to the next witness. Next member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for being here today. In December, I visited Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, where at a hangar, and I hope my colleagues go by and visit. It's to me, a shocking display of weapons that were seized in Yemen, which clearly have been provided by Iran. They make it very simple. Some of the materials, some of the weapons are in English, made in Iran. But really sad, one of the centerpieces is debris from a short-range missile fired by the Houthis in Yemen at a civilian airport in Saudi Arabia. So this is not just the conflict within the country, but it's a direct threat. And with the missile capability that is being provided by Iran, it's a direct threat to the whole region. And I indeed hope our colleagues go by and see this. With that in mind, Mr. Singh, how would you describe Iran's relationship with the Houthis? What kind of financial training and arms procurement support does Iran provide?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that from what I have seen, and I'm not privy to all the information on this, basically the Iranians are providing the Houthis with the types of weapons that you're describing, quite recklessly, I agree. And they're also providing them perhaps with some training to go along with these weapons. They're also providing them with oil, which constitutes financial assistance, more or less. The Houthis then tax that oil when distributing it. Again, I think that the Houthis are not exactly an Iranian proxy. I don't think the Iranians can tell the Houthis what to do. If we ask them, go tell them to stop. I think for the Iranians, this is really about destabilizing Saudi Arabia's border and not about anything aimed at resolving the conflict.
And I want to point out, too, that it was really clear the advanced drone technology, of all things, that has been provided to the Houthis, which could have far-reaching consequences. Mr. Hardin, last month, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo held the second strategic dialogue in Doha, Qatar, which reaffirmed our partnership with Qatar. The U.S. and Qatar affirmed support for a strong and unified Gulf Cooperation Council. Sadly, we have a circumstance of the ongoing dispute between Qatar and its neighbors, which impacts America's security interest. What can be done to address this?
Sorry, I'm not, frankly, the best person to answer how we resolve the Qatar GCC rift. It's extraordinarily complicated, and I'm not sure there's an easy path forward. And I'm also not sure how much leverage we actually have to make that happen, but I would defer to others.
And in fact, I was going to refer to Mr. Singh. Do you have any suggestions on how the United States can help resolve the conflict between Qatar and its neighbors who we all need to be working with?
Well, it's a long-standing rift, Congressman, and I think that, frankly, our tools are pretty limited to solve it. We've been trying, I think, to support the Kuwaiti mediation. I think we should continue to do that, but I think that there isn't much we can do directly to solve the problem. I think, frankly, we can continue to work with both sides, and we should continue to work with both sides and cultivate good relationships on both sides. Frankly, for better or worse, in this region as well as some other regions, we have experience working with allies who don't work well together.
And I appreciate you pointing out about Kuwait being involved. This is so important to our country with Al Udeid Air Base located in Qatar, the significance of our working with them, the potential for economic investments in our country. But again, I'm just so hopeful that Kuwait can make a difference. I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I listen, excuse me, as I listen to your comments, obviously a political solution is better than anything else. But how do you get a political solution when instability is promoted by the Iranians and they use it as a weapon for their security. So how do you get some sort of a political solution? I mean, the Iranians, they want instability. They don't want a political solution. And if you don't have Iranian on the table, I don't think there's a possibility of a political solution. And I'm not saying a military solution is the way to go, but, you know, I think that after the Iranian ideal that we withdrew from, I was just wondering, are they getting more aggressive, the Iranians? So,
Just in terms of political negotiations and solutions, this is a multi-dimensional, multi-actor war. By my count, there's at least 5 overlapping, interlocking wars. And so a political accommodation would have to resolve all of that. To the extent that the Yemeni people themselves can take the lead in resolving that, that would be the most useful. So civil wars that are externally funded and financed don't extinguish themselves easily at all. The evidence is very clear about that. So I'm not hopeful that we can get to a political accommodation anytime reasonably soon. Even if Martin Griffiths was able to reach an accommodation, that's only one element of it. That's the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis for all intents and purposes. There's 4 other wars that are going on. That's not a part of the negotiation. Just in terms of the Iranian Houthi element about this, I'd just like to kind of re-emphasize one point that Michael Singh made, and that is it costs the Iranians almost nothing to destabilize Saudi Arabia. It's a very easy way to continue to poke them and to unsettle them. And I did say in my statement for the record there was 216 Iranian ballistic missiles that have been fired into Saudi space. And in addition, the Houthis have at times controlled actual territory in Saudi. So this is an extraordinarily complicated conflict.
Just a couple points to add to underscore what Mr. Hardin was saying before. In some ways, actually, getting to a political accommodation between the Saudis and the Houthis is easier on the list of difficult conflicts than some of the other ones that are happening. Now, the Iranian element here remains a very problematic one, but in a way, choosing a strategy vis-a-vis Iran where it's you have to fulfill 17 conditions before we'll do anything with you makes it very difficult to try to do anything with respect to Yemen, because we have now essentially adopted an approach that tells the Iranians that there's kind of no carrot and stick related to their activities in Yemen whatsoever. It's all connected to a whole series of other broader issues. And I think that that strategy is unrealistic. And until we hear from the administration how they intend to size and shape their strategy vis-a-vis Iran to deal with the specific conflicts, including the conflict in Yemen, we're not going to make a lot of progress. But the one thing that we can do practically in the near term is work with our partners on disrupting and interdicting Iranian shipments, both by land and by sea, to the Houthis. And I think the United States should, and this should be there should be bipartisan support in Congress to press the administration to develop a strategy to do that.
Mr. Singh?
We should also recall that Iranian support to Hezbollah is meaningfully more substantial and more problematic for U.S. national security interests and U.S. interests in the region than its support to the Houthis.
Well, that's precisely what I'm saying. You know, you have Yemen, you have Lebanon, you have Syria. They were all playing the instability game there. So how do you come to a solution to this?
So I'm sorry. Go ahead, Maura.
Let me just quickly add. Yes, they are, and it's pretty easy for them to do so, and it's pretty cheap, particularly in the case of the Houthis. You know, the relationship with Hezbollah, decades and decades long, has only deepened in the last few years. You now have a situation where effectively Hezbollah is taking a number of steps, not in its interest domestically, but because the Iranians have made them do so. That is not the case with the Houthis. There is a differentiation between them.
Mr. Singh, just got
Sure. I think that we do want to see a political resolution to this conflict. I think our allies want to see a political resolution to this conflict. Iran does not, I think, want to see a political resolution to this conflict. The longer it goes on, the better it is, I think, for Iran, and the more the chance Iran has to deepen its influence there. By the way, I'll also add that I think that for Iran, it would be a major strategic victory if their actions in this conflict led us sunder our relationship with our traditional allies of 70-plus years in the region. And so we need to be very careful about doing so. I think that in Yemen, obviously, trying to drive the conflict to a resolution, a political resolution, which the Houthis have resisted, is important. I think across the region, denying Iran new opportunities to meddle is very important as well. And I think you do that really in two big ways. One is by strengthening our allies, and the other is by ensuring
my time
that—
is up. I don't want to keep taking other people's time.
Just to finish this thought very briefly, to ensure that these marginalized populations around the region really are embraced by their governments and not marginalized.
Thank you.
Mr. Perry, the chart prepared by the committee identifies you as a member from California, and I know that's an honor to which you aspire. But in the meantime, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panel. Mr. Sullivan, can you tell us what they behead people in Saudi Arabia for? What kind of alleged crimes or accusations are people beheaded for in Saudi Arabia, if you know?
I'm not an expert on Saudi criminal law, but they have had a history of beheading people for a range of crimes related to crimes against the state, blasphemy, other things that are somehow an affront either to the Saudi kingdom or to the religion of the country.
Sure. Violating the First Amendment as we would see it in the United States. How about drugs? Trafficking in drugs, narcotics.
So I don't know if that's a beheading offense.
Okay, well, I do know, and it is. And do you know how many beheadings on an average they have in Saudi Arabia?
I don't.
Okay, so The Guardian, not a bastion of conservatism, reported just last year that 12 per month. Now, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect this has been going on for a long time, and we've had a long relationship with Saudi Arabia. I'm curious about the newfound outrage. Look, what happened to Khashoggi is horrific. But the point is this is the Saudi Arabian government, and they do this in their country on a regular basis, on a daily basis almost. And I'm concerned about, it seems, the feeling of the panel, or at least some on the panel and some in our country, that we need to now detach ourselves from our relationship, a longstanding relationship with Saudi Arabia, over this issue alone, and put the region and the relationship and the greater issue in peril. That concerns me and that confuses me, and I find that intriguing that suddenly this is an issue after all this time. Now, you have said that we should abandon the current policy, and essentially I think what you said is do something more constructive regarding our posture vis-a-vis Iran. And I just heard what you talked about, interdicting some of the shipments and so on and so forth, but it almost portends that we should stop what we're doing now, because what we're doing now is making it worse, and interdict and try more diplomacy. And it seems to me that if we stop what we're doing now, Iran's not going to be like, well, listen, the Americans stopped, so we're going to take our foot off the gas, and we'll take it easy on Yemen now. I don't think they're going to do that. It seems to me we should continue what we're doing and add the other components of what you talked about. Is that something that you could espouse?
I strongly agree with you that Iran's reaction to the U.S. deciding to stop supporting the activities of the Saudi-led coalition is not going to lead them to stop fueling the conflict. They won't, which is why I'm proposing a two-step process, one in which we stop supporting something which is deeply ineffective to American interests and is helping Iran, and then second, we also step up activities that would be far more effective in curbing Iran's capacity to aid the Houthis.
So helping our ally, albeit flawed, our relationship is what it is. I'm sure you're all familiar with the petrodollar arrangement with Saudi Arabia over a long time. They are an imperfect actor in this, but you're saying that stopping, assisting, and targeting their targeting of their enemy, and potentially and substantially our enemy, supported by Iran, is going to help the situation?
I believe that the current coalition operations, particularly as they relate to the conflict vis-a-vis the Houthis, have been counterproductive to Saudi and Emirati interests, and counterproductive to American interests, and helpful to Iranian interests.
So the Saudis are working against their own direct interests.
In this case, I don't think they're doing it on purpose. They're not waking up in the morning and saying we want to do that, but the net result of their military operation has to put them in a worse position strategically vis-a-vis Iran. And the United States should be able to make a strategic assessment of that and say, let's course correct. Let's course correct in terms of American policy, and let's convince our partners that the best way forward here is not to continue the coalition operations
So
as
letting
they
Iran
have been carried out
have
so far.
free reign and free range over Yemen.
No, of course not. And that's why I'm arguing for a strategy that says enough with the bombing campaign, which has caused a significant number of civilian casualties, has disrupted the provision of humanitarian assistance, and has driven more people to the Houthi side, while not dislodging the Houthis from Sana'a, by the way. And let's instead really focus on the threat, which is the ballistic missile threat, the provision of material from Iran to the Houthis. Let's get focused like a laser beam on that and provide our partners with the tools and technologies they need to take that on. That will lead to greater Saudi and Emirati stability. That will undermine Iran's interest in the region. And I believe it will also contribute
Thank you, Mr.
to a
Sullivan. I don't
political
want to cut you
solution.
short, but I'm out of time here. It seems to me that applying more pressure as opposed to less on all fronts is a better strategy than relieving the pressure at one point and adding it to another and freeing them up completely on the battlefield. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've all said, I believe, that it's important to enhance our diplomatic efforts, our political efforts in the region, and not walk away from it. Let me give you an example of concern. It was brought up by Mr. Wilson when he was asking about Qatar. When the blockade was there, then Secretary Tillerson did begin diplomatic efforts. He contacted people in the region. He contacted our allies in Europe and asked for support and pressure to make a negotiated effort to resolve that. At the same time, with one of our allies, the President, when given that kind of opportunity to say, we are with the U.S., we've talked to Secretary Tillerson on this issue, we'll be with you on negotiations. The President responded, well, that was Tillerson's opinion. I'm with the Saudis. Now, how can the U.S. be effective in negotiating diplomatically when we're not speaking in one voice? How big of a problem is that? How damaging is that? First, as exerting our influence as a country itself, and secondly, trying to work with allies to try and enhance this diplomatic presence.
So I worked most recently in the Yemen Affairs Unit, which is our embassy in exile. Yemen and Saudi Arabia, it's not the first time that the administration or any administration speaks with mixed messages and conflicting
Yes, if I could interrupt. This was our Secretary of State and the President of the United States.
But you're asking a very specific question, and that is, what is it that we can do? And frankly, this is an extraordinarily complicated war. The humanitarian crisis is the worst in the world. We don't actually have enough people on the ground at the Yemen Affairs Unit to even begin to do any of the analysis that's underlying this and to work through some of the challenges. I mean, we can't be a great power if we don't have people in place. I mean, that's a simple answer to your larger question.
What about the
Also
importance? My
necessary.
time is limited, I'm sorry. What about our importance of our allies and trying to really bring them together as a coalition, particularly our European allies, and particularly in light of the JCPOA, with what's happening, that could cause a great division with our European allies in that region?
Our allies and partners are our comparative global advantage. There is no other power in the entire world that can command so many relationships. When something goes wrong, various countries look to Washington to help figure out what to do. That's good, and I'd rather it be us than Moscow or Beijing. Things we could do would be, say, having an ambassador in the UAE or in Saudi or in Qatar, having senior officials at the State Department who can focus on the Middle East. As Mr. Hardin said, we don't have enough people. I'd further that point. We don't have enough capable people with the right experience at the right level to actually allow the deft diplomacy, the carrots and sticks that we really need to exert in this complicated region.
Does anyone else see the danger in not being able to fully utilize that advantage we have as working as a coalition when you hear these things and you see the reactions with the JCPOA in our European allies?
You know, one of the things that really concerned me about the U.S. approach to the JCPOA is that in pulling out, we'd put ourselves at odds with all of the rest of our partners in NATO. And the Europeans don't have as heavy either a diplomatic influence or a military presence in the Middle East as we do, not by a long shot. But being able to speak with one voice with our European allies and partners, particularly when it comes to applying pressure to Iran, was a useful tool that we previously had that we have now put back on the shelf to a significant extent. We're trying to coerce the Europeans, but they are dragging their feet, and as a result, our capacity to influence Iranian behavior, I believe, is less than it was when we had global unity around that issue.
Well, thank you. Just a quick question back and forth. I know it's difficult, but we talked about the actions of the Saudi Crown Prince. We've talked about what he has done to repress women who've spoken up, where he's imprisoned them, where he's, and there's reports of torture and sexual harassment even. Would you call the Crown Prince a reformer by any stretch of the imagination, yes or no?
Look, Congressman, I agree with what you said, and I think we need to raise the profile of these issues in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. That said, I think when it comes to economic reform and some of those other things, you see that a lot of Saudis, especially young Saudis, do want to see the types of reforms that the Crown Prince has talked about. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. And the question is, can we support the pieces that we think would actually be good for Saudi Arabia, like diversifying its economy and allowing, expanding women's rights and reducing especially Saudi support for extremism, while trying to influence Saudi behavior on those other areas where, frankly, their policies are way out of whack with what we'd like to see them be. And
Thank you. My time is up, but I do agree with your points that shouldn't just be a binary relationship, all or nothing. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your first hearing. For the panel, thank you for being here. And I don't need to give anybody a history lesson. You guys know it. But if I look back with our involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, 17 going on 18 years, the trillions of dollars lost of life. I look at Russia when they fought in Afghanistan. I see what's going on in Syria, probably one of the worst, if not the worst, civil war in our history, with multiple competing factions. And then you look at Yemen with what's going on in there, and then we can go back in biblical times. It's really been conflict after conflict after conflict. I look at the Carter Doctrine that President Carter came up with, was to deal with energy, to deal with stability, and keeping the shipping lanes open there. And we talk about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which is terrible. And we talk about this conflict and that there's not a military solution to this, that we need to look to diplomacy. Is there a functioning government in Yemen? For the panel, is that a consensus? No, 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 4 no's? All right, if there's not a functioning government in Yemen, can you have a political solution to this? Anybody? Ms. Singh?
Well, look, I think—
Mr. Hardin, no, you come next then.
maybe we'll say the same thing. I'm not sure. But I think the ideal outcome to this, from our point of view, and frankly from our allies' point of view, would be some kind of power-sharing arrangement between the different factions. As my colleagues mentioned, there's multiple conflicts going on.
There is.
But in Yemen, that's typically been how these types of conflicts end, is through some kind of political compromise and power-sharing arrangement.
All right, real quickly, Mr. Hardin.
So in general, the Hadi government doesn't exercise much control, credibility, or legitimacy. There are pockets within the government that do, and I'd look to the central bank governor as a good example, which, by the way, is a crucial point. And as Mr. Singh had mentioned, the Yemenis have typically resolved the conflicts themselves. In this context, however, with all the external actors that are involved, we should brace ourselves for a war that's going to go on longer than any of us can bear.
It is, and it's something we just see over and over again. I mean, we look at what we did in Syria. You know, we supplied weapons to the Syrian Free Rebel fighters that wound up in the hands of the bad players. We're seeing it play out here, as the chairman brought up with the CNN report. There's got to be a better way, and then we talk about the UN has to get in there and put some influence on there. Can the UN even be effective in that area on a humanitarian crisis? If you don't have a political solution to this, and if you don't have a functioning government, you can't have a political solution. And it just seems like
a catch-22. You know, you just go around and around. It doesn't mean we don't try. But there's got to be something that we can do outside of the box that we haven't done that, I mean, you guys are smart people, ma'am. All of you. You're all smart. We should be able to bring resources together in a different way that we haven't done in the past. Any suggestions other than, well, we've got to do the humanitarian and have a political solution?
I mean, the humanitarian is extraordinarily expensive. It saves lives.
Oh, it is.
But it's also insanely expensive.
And it will never end unless we get a solution. So we're just treating a symptom.
I also want to just hammer home this point. We don't have enough people that are involved on this.
Enough people where?
We don't have enough American Foreign Service officers who are tracking Yemen in the Middle East. USAID has 3 people. Largest humanitarian crisis on the face of the earth in the region. I'm not counting all the people that are back.
Is that an agreement with everybody that more UN people there?
No,
USAID?
U.S. I'm talking about U.S.
Right. I'm sorry, U.S.
Yeah.
Boots on the ground.
I mean, I'm going to disappoint you on this, Congressman, because I think that there is no out-of-the-box solution to this. I think actually supporting the UN-led mediation effort as much as we can is probably our best bet right now. Martin Griffiths, the UN envoy, I think has made more progress recently than has been made in the past. I think there's hope.
Is he dealing with all factions that are fighting there or just the main one?
He's dealing, I think, specifically with this conflict between the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition, which is important to do. It's not the only conflict in Yemen. I think we need to support that and then bring our unique capabilities to bear on some of the other problems we've talked about. For example, interdicting the flow of arms to the Houthis, not just by sea, but also by land through Oman and so on.
Well, and we know it's coming from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and there's a lot of bad players in there. I'm out of time. It's just a frustrating thing again and a repeat of a kind of a Groundhog Day, and it's too bad for the people of Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on 2 questions. First off, our colleague, Mr. Wilson, raised the question of how do we solve this blockade and this challenge between the Saudis, UAE, Qatar, but more importantly, something that Mr. Keating touched on, and this may be a little bit in the weeds, but I think we have some concern, and I think this is bipartisan on both sides of the aisle, the decision-making process within the administration. And I'll use a very recent example, the decision-making process to withdraw from Syria, I think is a very big concern here. I was in the Middle East in December, and we had a chance to have dinner with our special envoy, Brett McGurk, and have a conversation with them. There was no indication, while we were making progress in the battle against ISIS, there was no indication that this was near done. We met with our military commanders outside of Doha, and again, their mission was progressing in a positive direction, but again, no indication that we were nearing the end here. Take that to what General Votel said yesterday, that he was not consulted and had no idea that this was coming. So, the following week after we get back from the Middle East talking to folks, a tweet goes out and says, mission's complete, and I have no idea how that decision was made. Best I can tell is the president had a conversation with Erdogan in Turkey and made some decisions. And I think that is real concerning to this body, and it should be concerning to all of us in Congress that there isn't that consultative process. And we don't have to guess if Mr. McGurk was consulted because he wrote a Washington Post op-ed that said he was not consulted. This is our special envoy who is there, who is our most knowledgeable person, and that is of deep concern. If we take that to the blockade, I have real concern about how the decision and what message we're sending to the Saudis. If you look at the president's relationship and Mr. Kirchner's relationship with the Crown Prince, he had a meeting here with the Crown Prince in March of 2017. In May of 2017, the president and Mr. Kirchner visited Saudi Arabia. And next thing you know, in June, early June, the Saudi blockade to Qatar started. Now, how can we address these issues if we don't actually know what the administration's strategy is, if we don't know what is leading to this. And best I can tell, we are told that National Security Advisor John Bolton has stopped the interagency decision-making process. And again, as a body that has oversight responsibilities here, I think we're very concerned about this. Dr. Carlin, maybe I'll start with you. Do you have any idea what the decision-making process within the administration is?
Everything I've heard echoes your profound concerns. These are hard issues. There's no easy answer. The last thing one would want to do is not actually try to deliberately think through them. And I think that is not only unhelpful for our policy, but it plays a really problematic signaling role to our allies, partners, frenemies, and adversaries. Part of the reason those troops in Syria are helpful is operational. Part of it is signaling. If there's uncertainty as to what's going to happen, just based on what happens in a tweet, it's really, really unhelpful.
Mr. Sullivan?
I think every administration, and I think Mr. Hardin made this point, struggles with coordination and speaking with one voice, but I believe the current administration has elevated this to a kind of art form, a disturbing art form. It's not in the same league as previous administrations in terms of any kind of credible, consistent policy process that produces results based on the evidence, the facts, and consultation with the military and civilian experts. And there are 4 basic consequences of this. The first is that it confuses and demoralizes our allies who don't know that they can count on us. The second is that it leaves our troops in a bad spot. They're out there twisting in the wind while the president's on again and off again when it comes to, say, leaving Syria. The third is that it emboldens our enemies. And finally, it undermines the credibility of the commander-in-chief himself, but also anyone else who goes out to purportedly speak on behalf of the United States, because no one can trust the word of an American official. And that has the net result, I think, of deeply undermining America's national security interests.
Mr. Singh?
I tend to agree that American unpredictability is certainly not a stabilizing factor here. I think our allies in this region and other regions are concerned about American unpredictability, and it leads them into all sorts of hedging behaviors which tend to be bad for us. I think that it's the president's right to make a decision, and every administration has a different decision-making process, and that balance between deliberating and sort of boldness is a different balance struck by every administration. But it's very important, I think, that when a decision is reached, we be very careful and sort of considered in the way that we carry out those decisions. And that's what I would personally like to see more of.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I know we're going to get more into the discussion of the details of the Saudi War Powers resolution, but I want to address some of that here. One of my biggest pet peeves in foreign policy is when people allow whoever is president to change their foreign policy view, because maybe they either want to just support this person or oppose this person. And by the way, my side did some of that as well. In 2013, when there was an attempt to bomb Syria for its use of chemical weapons, I had members of Congress come up to me and say that they think we should do it, but they're worried that they don't want to give President Obama the authority to do that. That was a huge pet peeve of mine. What else a huge pet peeve of mine is this newfound kind of religion on the situation in Yemen and the situation in Saudi Arabia that's been found by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I'd like to make the point that it seems in this Yemen debate and Yemen policy, it always comes back to somehow it's the United States and Saudi Arabia's fault for a humanitarian crisis, even though there's sometimes a caveat which says, as Mr. Sullivan did in his testimony, to be clear, the coalition does not bear all of the responsibility for the violence and suffering in Yemen. Well, that's true, because as something that I think is not discussed very often is that the Houthis overthrew a legitimate government. The Houthis use food as weapons to starve innocent civilians. And as terrible as every bomb that misses its target or it hits an intentional target of innocent civilians from the Saudis is, I can point to incidences where the Houthis, and backed by their Iranians, used weapons to kill innocent people and to block innocent children from having food to put into their mouths to live by. We look at the Houthis that place war materials among civilians so that the Saudis bomb it. This is not a new tactic to us. We've seen it from the beginning of war in the Middle East. Civilians are actually to be used in the information side of war so that hopefully the Saudis, in the thinking of the Houthis, bomb this facility or something we have, kill civilians, and then we can go to the international media and try to turn them against the Saudis. Our assistance for the Saudis, by the way, started under a prior administration, and it's only recently that it has become an issue to use as an attack against President Trump. While I appreciate having this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I really do, and I think this is the beginning of the discussion that Congress ought to have on this issue, in about 2 hours, we're going to vote to try to take away the president's ability to be commander-in-chief. We're going to vote, probably out of this committee, to take away the president's ability to use counterterrorism strategies in the Arabian Peninsula to destroy the enemies of the United States of America. Most of the members of this committee are new. Most of the members of this committee have never sat through a classified briefing about what's really going on in Yemen. We had that last year. And even though some complained that it wasn't deep enough, I agree. Let's do another one with this whole committee before we go voting on policies that have to do with life and death. If we take our material support away from Saudi Arabia, it's not like Saudi Arabia is going to quit executing the war, but what they will quit doing is living to some extent by the law of armed conflict that we demand they do. They will to some extent quit living by when we enforce on them and show them the legitimate targets in Yemen. And now they'll see more illegitimate targets, potentially of targets, because they don't have the resources that the United States has. So while I understand and am concerned and am compassionate about the humanitarian concerns in Yemen, the reality is if we act politically on this committee, which I think we're poised to do, because we can all go out on TV and say that we're opposing the Trump administration, because we can all go out on TV and say that we're fighting for humanitarian rights, which we all want to do, but the impact of that will be far beyond, I think, what we're even debating now. So I hope that when we do that, and I'm going to talk more about it then, that we actually think about maybe having a classified briefing, bring Republicans and Democrats in, and talking about what's really at stake. Mr. Singh, just with the 40 seconds I have left, what happens if the United States pulls all material support for Saudi Arabia and the coalition? Is it going to save lives, or do you think it might potentially cost more lives?
Well, I would say two things, Congressman. One is the war will go on. I think that it will not cause the conflict in Yemen to end. The suffering there will continue, and I do worry that we then lose our leverage and influence with those allies. But second, I also worry, frankly, about the wider effect, again, of considering these types of activities, intelligence sharing, mid-air refueling under acquisition and cross-servicing agreements, to be engaging in hostilities. I mean, what does that mean for the routine types of cooperation we do with allies around the world? So I think it goes even beyond Yemen.
Ms. Wild from Pennsylvania.
I want to switch gears and ask all of you this, but I'm specifically directing my questions to Dr. Carlin. The Saudi-led coalition is reportedly recruiting and deploying children to fight in the Yemen campaign, as I understand it, including a large number of children from Sudan. And some reports suggest 20% of the units are made up of children, while others report 40%. Some of these children have been reported as wearing U.S.-produced uniforms and carrying U.S. weapons. Under the Child Soldier Prevention Act of 2008, the U.S. is prohibited from providing several types of military assistance to governments known to use child soldiers. My question to you is this, and as I said, it's to any of you who can offer information on this. What oversight is available to determine Saudi compliance with the Child Soldier Prevention Act? And are we employing those oversight efforts? And what should Congress be asking of the administration to ensure that the coalition is complying with this?
I think there's two questions in here. Question one is, what effect is our support having? That's come up in a lot of the questions, right? Are we playing a more positive role or a more problematic role? The second question that I think you're walking to is, are our partners actually following U.S. law? whether it's Leahy Law, whether it's the Child Soldier Protection Act, and all of that should be reported by the Departments of State and Defense, potentially in classified hearings, but that is incumbent on them to be able to say at a minimum whether or not our partners are actually following our laws. And frankly, if they're not, then the first question is almost moot.
Does anybody else have anything to add on that? Okay, I want to switch gears then to Mr. Hardin. I understand that you don't believe that humanitarian aid is the only path forward. In fact, we need to open up lines of commerce and so forth. But I'm deeply concerned that despite the huge amount of aid that has been directed to Yemen, despite the Food and Agricultural Organization providing crops and vegetable seeds and fishing gear and poultry production kits and vaccinations and treatment for livestock, and despite UNICEF treating nearly 230,000 children suffering from a severe acute malnutrition, this conflict still prevents significant obstacles to reaching the 12.5 million Yemenis that we've been unable to reach. So understanding that your position is that humanitarian aid is not really the direction we need to go in, I think that's your position. What concrete actions should be taken to ensure that we do have humanitarian access for the UN and international NGOs?
Yeah, so humanitarian aid is vital for the most vulnerable, and we should not minimize it. My point is that of the total amount of basic commodities that go into Yemen, so food and medicine, 95% of it is imported through private sector channels, and so that really has to be the solution. This is not a drought famine, so it's not that there's not enough food in the markets. There's enough food in Yemen. It's a pricing and currency collapse issue. The splintering of the central bank in September of 2016 was a unique event in civil wars. It doesn't happen in civil wars, and this happened here. And what that caused is an immediate deleveraging of the economy that made basic commodities out of reach of households. And so stabilizing and let me just add one other point. In my 25 years of engaging in civil wars and complex crises, I personally haven't come across a situation like this with the central bank basically deleveraging into regional, sub-regional banks. And so that crisis is the primary driver for the inability of people to pay for food. There's a lot that the Saudis and others could do. And by the way, to the point, the Houthis could end the humanitarian crisis tomorrow. They're the only actor that actually has that capability. I think that that's important. All the other actors can impact it, but they're the ones that actually could give up Hodeidah port and allow food to flow in through all avenues. I think that the Saudis should open up their land border crossings in a much more robust way to allow food to come in, and that all ports should be robustly engaged. And the last point I will just say is the Hadi government allows for a system of vast corruption that impedes the flow of basic commodities into the country.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Mass from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to start by saying I have thoroughly enjoyed this debate on both sides and your comments. I think there's been a lot of insight been given here. And that being said, I just want to kind of get an overview of your perspective on the region to help me gauge some of the comments that were made. So I just have a couple questions that I think will assist me in this. Just number one, when we look at this Middle East Cold War that's going on throughout the region, I'd love to know, do you consider it possible or likely that we see open war between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Number one, just we can go down the line. I don't care what side we start on here.
I'd say, Congressman, that I do think it's possible. I think as you see these, as I said, sort of bouts of regional interventionism, as you see the Iranians looking to take advantage of destabilized situations, I don't think we can rule out that that could then lead to more direct conflict between the powers involved.
I think it's definitely possible. I would not today go so far as to say likely, but it could shift from possible to likely with a trigger just like that.
Any further on a trigger that you might?
Sure. I mean, there's a few different things here. First, as Mr. Singh was saying before, the Iranians, before the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, after, will always look for opportunities to escalate their destabilizing activities across the region. They could overreach someplace which would cause a reaction from the Saudis, or for that matter, from the United States itself. Secondly, the Saudis, particularly if they are continued to give a blank check, could increase their own regional adventurism vis-a-vis the Iranians. And so I think both of these could contribute to what is now certainly a possibility of conflict between them, but could move up the continuum to likely, on the basis of each side feeling that they've got the wind at their backs to go against the other.
Ma'am?
I agree with both Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Singh and have nothing to add.
Sir.
Sorry, then I think we'll more likely see proxy battles than direct conflict, but I wouldn't rule it out. The other element I would add is that I see a realignment between the Israelis and the Sunni bloc that will deepen over the next years.
I think that's a good lead into my next question. Give me a good outline of who you see as the, should this occur, the Saudi coalition versus the Iranian coalition. Give us a broad perspective of that, whether you want to go down into militias specifically or just into countries.
Let's start with Mr. Singh.
Well, it's a tough question to answer in the hypothetical. Iran tends in the region to work through proxies. They have an asymmetric strategy. So in Lebanon, we see Hezbollah. In Syria, they're importing not just Hezbollah from Lebanon, but Pakistani and Afghan groups, as well as Iraqi Shia militias. In Yemen, they have provided support to the Houthis, and so on and so forth. Whereas we have seen the Saudis and Emiratis operate in what I would say is a more traditional way, using their own forces directly and then partnering with the likes of, say, the Hadi government and sort of allies on the ground there. Again, it's hard to answer in the hypothetical. It would depend on where the conflict is. Is it an Israel-Iran conflict in the Golan Heights? Is it, something that's erupting in the Gulf? That would really determine sort of who the players are and how it shapes up.
I would just add, I'm not entirely sure that the UAE or the Saudis have the power projection to really take a fight to Iran, and would probably pursue a destabilizing proxy battle like the Iranians are doing in Yemen, but somewhere on the Iranian border, perhaps with the Kurds or others.
Mr. Hardin, you keep...
So I was just going to add, and one big difference, of course, is the Iranians have had a whole lot of practice working with proxies. They're really good at it and have only gotten better in recent years, and I wouldn't say that's the case, say, with the Saudis.
I agree. They have done a great job. I actually call it colonizing the region. That's what in my opinion, I see them out there doing. But again, you keep leading me into exactly where I want to ask. When we look at certainly what on the Iranian side could be considered a Shia coalition, what kind of force do we surmise that they could produce in the region with that kind of Shia coalition?
Well, beyond their direct capacities that they have built up and continue to build up, they've recently tested ballistic missiles further to attack potential state targets in Saudi and the UAE. Probably the most sophisticated, most well-armed militia that has some amount of command and control coming out of Tehran is Hezbollah, which has tens of thousands of rockets and missiles pointed at Israel. And if I was to look at the single most proximate threat to a core U.S. national security interest in the region emanating from Iran, below Iran getting its hands on weapons of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon, its ability to use Hezbollah to threaten the state of Israel is at the top of the list.
My time has expired.
All right.
Again, I appreciate everybody's comments today.
Any other responses on that question can be submitted for the record. We'll go now to Dean Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all of our witnesses. Mr. Singh, in your opening testimony, you referred to the next phase in Yemen, presumably from a kinetic conflict to diplomacy. I've heard conflicting perspectives outside of this room on whether that's already underway and even if it's achievable at all. I'd welcome each of your perspectives, starting with you, Mr. Singh, on if there's any evidence that that's already occurring, and if so, if you could expand on it.
Well, I think it's certainly our hope, and frankly, I've heard from the coalition members directly that it's their hope that we have now moved into a political phase, as it were, of the conflict. And I think that that hope rests upon this current UN-led mediation succeeding. We've had the Stockholm Agreement, which was a breakthrough in a sense. It hasn't been perfectly implemented. We've seen lots of Houthi violations. But I think the hope is that that will stick, and if it sticks, we can then build on it with confidence-building measures and other steps around Yemen that will start to de-escalate the conflict. And of course, the question that raises, I'm sure, in everyone's mind is, well, what if it fails? What then happens? And I go into this in my written testimony. I think that if that happens, we need to encourage our partners and work with them, frankly, to craft a strategy to address what we consider the most significant threats emanating from this country. So that would be, as Mr. Sullivan was talking about, the Iranian arms going into Yemen and then the firing of missiles and rockets. It would be improving the access for humanitarian supplies. It would be trying to protect the maritime corridors there, and so on and so forth. That would be, frankly, a difficult conversation with our partners, but I'm not sure that we're in totally different places from our partners on those points.
Thank you. Others?
I think the Stockholm Agreement that was reached in December that Special Envoy Griffiths is trying to carry forward is deeply fragile right now and could break down at any time. One of the key markers will be whether this prisoner exchange that's under negotiation as we speak actually goes through, and then whether or not the two conditions that Griffiths has identified as having to hold, that there be no strikes within the ceasefire area and no offensive efforts to take territory, continue. So, and I agree with Mr. Singh that actually the coalition, to a greater extent than the Houthis, in my view, wants to see this sustained. And I agree with Mr. Hardin that the Houthis have more power to actually cause the provision of humanitarian assistance to get through Hodeidah right now. And I think that working with the entire international community to bring as much pressure to bear on ensuring we do move into that next phase is the most important thing in the days and weeks ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Carlin.
It's hard to be sanguine about the situation in Yemen and how much better it could look a year or 2 years from now, no matter which phase it goes into. I might suggest where you really want to focus on is 3 opportunity costs. First, obviously, the horrific humanitarian situation. Second, the price we pay to try to contain what is coming out of it. And third, the distraction that it poses both for us and for our regional partners.
I think that while I believe there is no military solution to this, and most of us who follow this believe that, I think the combatants believe that there is a military solution. And so the Stockholm Agreement may hold and it may deepen, but if I were to bet, I would say that the Stockholm Agreement fails and that we have a battle for Hodeidah sometime in the next year. And I will just point out that the situation has only gotten worse in the past year. So the humanitarian appeal this time last year from UN OCHA was $3 billion. In February, at the end of February, it's going to be $4 billion. So I agree, it's hard to be sanguine.
All right. Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. Congressman Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel for being here. There's been a lot of focus on the CT threat coming out of the region. Specific to Yemen, are you seeing any CI and or cyber concerns coming out? Number one. And number two, from our domestic intel community perspective, do you feel the U.S. intelligence community and all the agencies that are part thereof are sufficiently on top of all the complications in that region? There's funding concerns, there's recruitment issues as well on our intel side. What's your assessment of how on top of the region and all the complications that exist therein?
So I think that the chaos in Yemen, including the chaos in the southern portion of Yemen, because primarily we've been talking about the north, gives space for terrorists. And that space is probably deepened. I don't think that we can kill our way out of it. And so I agree with the assessment that AQAP has a very large and sustained base in Yemen. In terms of cybersecurity threats, I would be doubtful that would originate from Yemen.
I would just add that just as it's created greater safe havens and frankly, weapons and recruitment opportunities for AQAP, I do think it's had some hindrance to our operational capability to develop the kind of on-the-ground efforts against AQAP. Not so much the direct operations that the UAE and others are working, but building the kind of strategy that we had before the conflict started to try to weaken AQAP's grip in some of those southern provinces. With respect to the broader question of resources, I don't know enough about where things lie in the intelligence community to answer, but I would say that I'm very impressed with the intelligence community's general development of knowledge, particularly about the counter-terrorist threat coming out of Yemen over the past many years, and the contributions they've made, as our partners, the Saudis and Emiratis, have made to foil plots that the ranking member was referring to in his opening statement.
So I would just add, I think we have, together with the Emiratis especially, been able to enjoy some success against AQAP. There have been several high-profile HVTs who have been taken down in Yemen in the last year or two. Your larger question about cyber, I think, is a good one for this region, because I think we have seen in this region, as this kind of tripartite conflict or rivalry has developed that I talked about, seen cyber tools used in a sort of groundbreaking way by lots of parties in the region. And we've seen the Iranians, as was detailed in the DNI's worldwide threat assessment, increasingly use those tools against the United States in particular. I think there's also a growing maritime and missile threat in the region, and I think that that will grow in part because, let's not forget that next year, 2020, the conventional arms ban on Iran will end under the JCPOA, the Iran Nuclear Accord. And so, do we have enough resources devoted to this? I'm not sure. I think that's a question that you should be asking the intelligence community and the administration in general. But I do worry that, especially as we're sort of rebalancing towards Asia, towards the Russia challenge, that it is possible that we could see a shortfall in resources devoted to these problems.
Thank you. Colin Allred of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank Chairman Engel for calling this as our first hearing. I am deeply concerned with the results of our involvement in Yemen. I'm also cognizant of our regional relationships there and their importance for us and our mission and our ongoing mission against AQAP there. I think that we are here today to discuss this region, certainly, but also to talk about the role of Congress in our foreign policy. We have seen, I think, a number of steps by past Congresses to cede some of that authority. And I think that it's important that we exercise our constitutional duties to oversee what's going on and how U.S. involvement is playing out around the world. And so that's why I think it's so important that we're here today. And Dr. Carlin and Mr. Singh, you have both mentioned in your statements the trend in our foreign policy away from counterterrorism and towards great powers and state actors. So I want to talk about Iran, as others have as well. As you know, Iran has provided support and training and ballistic missiles to the Houthi rebels, despite the blockade that's been in place since 2015. And heavy weaponry, such as long-range missiles, have been used against targets inside Saudi Arabia and against our own ships. Dr. Carlin, how can the U.S. help its partners more effectively interdict these weapons from these shipments from Iran, both at sea and via land?
Thank you. Part of what we can do is work with our partners together on knitting together cohesive ways, both in the air and by sea, to try to counter these weapons. So that involves things like maritime security exercises, looking at the sorts of assistance, maybe through wargaming or tabletop exercises, showing our partners the sorts of capabilities that they need to be able to effectively counter these challenges.
Thank you. And are there any additional sanctions or measures that can be taken by the Department of Treasury to contain Iran's ability to use front companies or individuals to traffic arms to the Houthi rebels? And where are the pressure points that we can assert that pressure with the Houthis? To Mr. Singh.
You know, I tend to think, going back to what Mr. Hardin said about the fact that it's really the Houthis in control of that Hodeidah port through which not just humanitarian assistance and food and so forth passes, but also presumably some weapons. We would like to see, I think, much more international pressure on the Houthis. So far, there's been a lot of conversation about the Saudis and Emiratis. A lot of those concerns are justified and valid, I think. But we've seen far less conversation about the role that the Houthis are playing, both in sort of the importation of weapons and the suffering that's taking place. I'd like to see more action on that front. I think we should be recruiting our allies elsewhere in the world, especially Europe, to join us in that, as well as to join us in that interdiction mission. And I think I'd like to see the focus of our conversations about Iran with those allies be that sort of issue, rather than, say, the nuclear agreement and so on and so forth.
Mr. Sullivan, you've spoken some about the steps we need to take to counter Iranian influence. Can you expound upon that and how we can use our Arab allies in the region to counter that?
Sure. I mean, one of my concerns, which I express in my written testimony, is that the current strategy seems to be to try to ratchet up pressure generally to no kind of clearly defined end. It seems like maybe the end is regime change, and we won't stop until we're at that. And my view is that you build up pressure against an adversary like Iran in an effort to convert that pressure into some progress on an issue that matters to us. We did that with the nuclear deal. I agree with Mr. Singh, we have to look at a broader range of issues beyond the nuclear deal as well. But my biggest concern about what the administration is doing right now is that it seems to just be pressure for pressure's sake, not pressure to actually try to produce practical change on the ground in the region. So, for example, you asked a question about authorities. I do think that if we dedicated some resources at Treasury to specifically tracking the means by which these weapons are transferred and ultimately delivered, Mr. Singh mentioned that it's not just sea, it's by a land route as well, that we would be in the position to be able to put some curbs on that, both through intelligence-led operations, but also through the application of financial sanctions. My concern is that instead we're just taking a very broad-based approach with the hope of kind of crashing the regime, and I think that is, A, not in keeping with U.S. policy, but B, and more importantly, it is prohibiting us from focusing on trying to shape Iran's behavior on more targeted bases like their support for the Houthis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Panel, thank you for being here today. I, too, have enjoyed this discussion. I've heard the word chaos a lot today, and I'm gonna use it again. My experience is that no matter where you go in this world, if there's chaos, when you peel back that curtain, you're going to see influences from China and from Russia. Is that the case here? And can you give me a sense of how much influence is being exerted by those two countries? Mr. Singh, let me maybe start with you and others that may want to comment on that.
Are you asking Congressman specifically about Yemen or about the Gulf region in general?
My thought was specifically about Yemen, but I'd be curious to know just the overall influence in the region.
I think what we do see in the overall region is certainly an increased interest by Russia in becoming involved in the Middle East and in the Gulf region as well, in an effort to sort of project their own influence and power, to blunt American influence, and to do other things like sort of promote their arms sales and so on and so forth. So they're competing with us, for example, for arms sales in places like Saudi Arabia and so forth. The Chinese, to some extent, are doing the same thing, competing. That we've seen, for example, a significant increase in the export of armed drones by China to places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The Chinese, I think, are less active, or at least less overtly active in the region than the Russians are. But I think we'll see their involvement increase. They're involved right now in the development of an Omani port called Duqm, which is sort of at a pivot point between the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. They've established their first overseas military base in the Horn of Africa in Djibouti, where, as I mentioned, a lot of these states, the UAE, Turkey, and others, are also very active, and where, of course, the U.S. is very active. And so I think there is a worry that you do see, especially Russia, partnering with Iran, partnering with Iran's proxies. We see this clearly in Syria, in a way which is destabilizing and potentially threatening to the United States. And I also worry about the potential for the development of more great power conflict in the region, especially as China steps up its activities.
You mentioned just a brief moment ago the need to call on our allies with the Houthi to influence the Houthis. And when you said that, it made me wonder who truly influences them, and would that influence be greater by Russia? And is that a possibility? And if so, should we be calling on Russia for help with humanitarian aid, specifically in that venue?
You know, I don't know that the Russians have direct influence on the Houthis. I don't get that perception. Where Russia comes into it, I think, is Russia obviously sits on the UN Security Council as a veto-wielding member of that council and has the ability to, as they have done time and time again, especially in recent years, protect Iran, which is Russia's main partner in the region, and by extension, Iran's proxies. And so I think where you need the Russians is to allow sort of the UN Security Council to play a bigger role here. And maybe our Saudi allies or Emirati allies, you know, countries where Russia would like a role, like a relationship, the Israelis can play a role in putting pressure on Russia to do that. My point more broadly is I think that there hasn't been enough of that international pressure on the Houthis. And I think that's especially important because I'm not sure there is any single external power that can compel the Houthis to the table or sort of force a solution on them.
Okay, Mr. Harding.
I would agree. I mean, there's not a lot of leverage points for the Houthis. Part of their power is the fact that they're so indigenous and so capable of operating within their own country. And again, I just want to reemphasize one point. They're not proxies of Iran. They have common aligned interests, and they use those interests to further their own benefit. But the only leverage points might possibly be the Omanis. Back to China and Russia in terms of the chaos in Yemen, I don't see it, to be quite frank, except for the race for the ports, which would include some Yemeni ports. And clearly, both the UAE and China have great port desires. Djibouti is a great example.
I would just add that we have historic examples where active and serious U.S. diplomacy has pushed the Russians out of the Middle East. And when you see a lack of it, unsurprisingly, it's an easy place for them to make problems.
Good. Thank you. I yield my time.
Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panelists for your erudite and excellent discussion. I want to put you on notice that I'm here representing my 13-year-old daughter, Molly, who was bat mitzvahed on December 15th, and she wrote her Torah talk on the unimaginable suffering in Yemen and our complicity in it. So she'll be watching. My first question is for Dr. Carlin. During the first year of the Saudi military campaign, many of the indiscriminate attacks on Yemeni civilians, hospitals, markets, schools, were ascribed to Saudi pilots' inexperience, high-altitude aerial bombardments, and other forms of negligence. Over time, however, Saudi bombings of school buses, cholera treatment centers, and the use of double-tap strikes suggested that this was a more intentional strategy. Would you agree with that assessment?
Thank you. You know, the Saudis don't actually have much of a history of using their military. For a very long time, they spent lots and lots of money buying all sorts of sophisticated capabilities. So Yemen has been kind of their testing and, you know, their operational testing ground, for better or worse, and largely it appears worse. I think the Obama administration's view was, if they're going to start to engage, let's see how we can be helpful here. And that's why you saw the support that really started in 2015. As I've said previously, I don't see much evidence that that support has been helpful. And I'm not sure whether it is deliberate or indeliberate. I don't think I'm capable of making that call without access to classified information. However, it is worrisome that they don't appear to be getting a whole lot better.
All right, well, under those circumstances, what should the U.S. do? Should we work to try to change the coalition's behavior, or should we try to extricate ourselves entirely? That's another question for you,
Of course. So I would suggest a mix of carrots and sticks. I'd figure out what sort of capabilities we can help the Saudis acquire. So, for example, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, the THAAD system, could help them feel more secure at home. And I think that that's a pretty decent carrot, but I would also work on sticks and show them that we are willing, potentially with a national security waiver, to have this body say that their efforts are extremely problematic and we don't want to support them anymore.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to human rights within Saudi Arabia and ask a question to Mr. Sullivan. Under MBS, the Saudi government has cracked down on dissidents and human rights activists. Reports indicate that authorities have arrested and even tortured activists. Is it fair to say that the U.S. has leverage to press Saudi leadership to respect human rights?
You know, it's always a complicated question, our leverage to get other countries to conform to our values and our human rights standards. Oftentimes we overestimate the leverage we have, but a lot of times we turn a blind eye to bad behavior by close partners to the detriment of our interests and our values. And I think in the case of Saudi Arabia, and this was true under Democratic administrations as it has been under Republican administrations, I think we have too frequently been willing to say we've got to make human rights concerns a 5th, 6th, or 7th tier priority rather than something on the plane with other more fundamental interests that we have, and I think that should change. Will we be able to get them to fully live up to our expectations? Probably not, but can we do a better job than we have done? I believe we can.
And how has the Trump administration been doing in using what leverage we do have?
I think the Trump administration has actually sent a very clear message, not only that they don't really care about the issue, but even more, they're perfectly happy to have the Saudis crack down on folks within their own country. That's the Saudis' business as far as Donald Trump is concerned.
Thank you. Let me ask you another question about the Trump administration. The government of Saudi Arabia has reportedly spent heavily at Trump hotels in Washington and Chicago, and apparently financial relationships between the president and the Saudis go way back. In October, the Chicago Tribune reported that Trump's business relationships with the Saudi government and rich Saudi business executives go back to at least the 90s. In Trump's hard times, the Saudi prince bought a super yacht and a hotel from him. The Saudi government has paid him $4.5 million for an apartment near the United Nations. Is it possible that the president's conflicts of interest have impacted the administration's actions or lack thereof when it comes to Saudi Arabia?
You know, it's amazing that this question can even be posed with such credible evidence behind it. That's where we have arrived, and it's not just with Saudi Arabia, that the potential that this president's personal interests are conflicting with the American national interest. That is certainly possible with Saudi Arabia. It's certainly possible with a number of other countries, and I do think that this committee and this Congress should take a hard look at that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pence.
Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, I'd like to start by saying how honored I am to serve alongside you and represent Hoosier values on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you. To all the witnesses today, thank you for being here, your time, and your fascinating testimony, educational. Mr. Singh, specifically, I found your testimony to be particularly interesting. Specifically, I'm interested in your opinion on the most effective role of Congress with respect to the U.S. policy in the Arabian Peninsula. In your written statement, you expressed your view that it would be a mistake to end our partnership with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. You've talked about that today as well. You continue by saying that this should not prevent us from having frank conversations with our partners when disagreements arise. Instead, you suggest, and I quote, the U.S. should concentrate its efforts in a number of areas. In that spirit, you listed examples such as improving allied military effectiveness, improving coordination among partners, pressing for democratic and reform, and reinvigorating regional diplomacy. In your opinion, what do you think is the most effective role of Congress to help achieve our strategic objectives while also promoting and protecting our fundamental American values? Is there one of these areas that you identified that stands out where Congress should, as you say, concentrate its efforts?
Well, sure, Congressman, and thank you for taking the time to read my testimony. I do think that when you're in government working on these issues, you have a tendency to have a hard time looking beyond even the next week. You know, a situation like Yemen, the situation with Saudi Arabia, these are fast-moving situations in a region which is a very turbulent region. I think what Congress can really do in a way that's hard for the executive branch to do, besides, of course, its constitutional roles of oversight and providing that sort of that check, is take a longer-range view. For example, look at the systemic risks of arms sales to the region. You know, you're asked to approve or disapprove individual arms sales, but there's no reason you can't step back and look at the whole and say, you know, is this adding to stability or is this detracting from stability? Is this advancing or setting back our interests? When it comes to human rights, which we were just talking about, again, oftentimes I think that even if American officials care about human rights, want to press them, there tend to be 4 or 5 other issues, which are this week's issues, which get in the way. And so I think Congress, again, can play a very useful role in ensuring that human rights, and not just human rights, but political reform, economic reform, remain on the agenda for U.S. policy. And I do think, frankly, and I think that we are seeing this today in Yemen, that congressional pressure can play a role in shaping the actions of our partners. And so we may have a very close partnership with Saudi Arabia, with Yemen, and when the CENTCOM commander goes and talks to them, he may be talking to them about operational issues. But when a CODEL comes, when Congress speaks, I think oftentimes it can put some of that pressure on, especially on those longer-term issues, in a way which is tougher for American officials to do.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you. Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you very much to those presenting today. I appreciate your time. I wanted to start with a question for Mr. Singh. General Votel made comments yesterday talking about the fact that U.S. military engagement with Saudi Arabia and the UAE allows us to have leverage and influence over their actions in Yemen. And in your comments today, you made a comment to the effect that we should expect our partners to follow human rights norms, but we can't tie it together with our engagement. I would ask if you could expound upon that ever so briefly about how it is that we can continue our engagement or could continue our engagement, be it with Saudi Arabia, UAE, or any other country, and separate that from the expectation that we have of how it is that they are engaging.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and let me just start by saying thanks for your continued service to the country in your new role. I want to be very clear about what I mean when I write this. I think it is absolutely appropriate for us to tie arms sales, security assistance programs, training, and so forth to the way that our partners are conducting themselves in war. Mm-hmm. You know, to the question that was asked earlier, I think if we don't believe that our partners are committed to following the laws of war and international norms of warfare, we should not be partnering with them. It's very important for our military that we not be asking them to compromise themselves, their morals, their values, by working with partners who are not committed to those values. What I'm trying to point out, though, is when we talk about those larger issues of politics, of human rights, of social reform, and so forth, I don't think it's been effective to try to tie those issues to security assistance, to use security assistance sort of in a crude way as leverage over unrelated issues. I think that our track record, and I've, you know, as a U.S. official and as an observer, been through so many of these cases, I think our track record in doing that is poor.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And then my other question, and I'll open this up to you, Mr. Sullivan. During your opening statement, you made the distinction between offensive and defensive military support to Saudi Arabia. And I was wondering if you could expand upon that briefly. How can we ensure that weapons, intelligence, military capabilities that we're providing to Saudi Arabia are for defensive purposes, not offensive purposes, and where you might see some of that overlap and challenges in the way that we're looking at this question?
It's an especially pertinent question in light of the recent reports that what we would historically have classified as a defensive system, like the TOW missile system, is being used offensively, having fallen into the wrong hands, the hands of extremist groups and others. So I concede that a clean distinction between offensive and defensive systems is not always easy to come by. But I do think there are some clear cases, and the two cases that I referred to in my testimony were, one, theater missile defense and missile defense systems more broadly. Dr. Carlin mentioned the possibility of THAAD. I think we could pretty well agree that that's a classically defensive system that can't be used readily for offensive purposes. And then secondly, that the United States itself would increase the conduct of maritime patrols where we control the extent to which we're engaged defensively as opposed to offensively. So those are the types of things that I have in mind, rather than the sorts of things which fall on that line and we may hope they be used for defensive purposes but could easily be converted to offensive purposes.
Okay, and I have one last question that I would like your input on. As a former intelligence officer myself, I'm sure you're aware that last week it was revealed that the UAE hired a team of former U.S. intelligence officials to help with their cybersecurity and electronic surveillance. What actions should the U.S. government take, if any, in your estimation, to prevent former intelligence officers from using the tradecraft that they learn through their service to the United States on behalf of a foreign government or a private company in this way?
Congresswoman, I read the same reports and was disturbed by them. There isn't currently a legal framework for tradecraft. There is for, obviously, the provision of classified information, but not for tradecraft, particularly this specialized tradecraft that intelligence officers, and you know this better than anyone, are getting in the United States that they can then go ply to other countries. I think that's pretty disturbing, but I also think that because it's an issue that I don't think has been much on the mind of policymakers or legislators of late, it requires some real study. And so what I hope this committee and others will do is take up this question. Should there be additional legal restrictions on the training and craft that intelligence officers are getting for use elsewhere? I would just add that there are some reports that suggest this tradecraft was turned back on American citizens or American companies. I think that clearly is against the law. But even if it's being used just out there in the world, not in relation to U.S. citizens, I think we are going to need further legal parameters around it. But I would defer to a deeper dive into the issue and the trade-offs and leave it at that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Watkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Mr. Singh. Sir, what tools and strategies are the U.S. using to help our Gulf partners stop Iran's smuggling of weapons to the Houthis?
So my understanding of what we're doing is something which is not limited to Yemen, right? Because obviously we're concerned about the Iranian proliferation of weapons around this region. And there is a toolkit that we can draw on to address it. It starts with intelligence. We have the best, I think, intelligence. Israel obviously has very good intelligence as well in terms of detecting the movement of weapons from Iran to the region. One of the reasons we're concerned, just as a footnote, about Iran, say, establishing missile factories in, say, Lebanon or Syria, is that that reduces kind of our visibility into the movement of these weapons. And that's something we should be concerned about potentially in Yemen in the future, not perhaps today as well. So there's the intelligence aspect. And then there's the partnering aspect with countries in the region, Oman, countries on the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, to then act on that intelligence to ensure that weapons can, in fact, be interdicted when they're on their way. That is something which I would say happens more rarely. Oftentimes, by setting up the right mechanisms, you can deter the movement of weapons in the first place. You don't often get to that point of actual interdiction. I think there's a third element to it, though, and this element is much harder, and that's cost imposition. You know, part of deterrence is not just erecting barriers to these actions, it's ensuring that there's a penalty to be paid when they do succeed. There, I think we've not been as successful because balancing the risk of escalation with the need to impose costs is something that every administration has struggled with. I'm concerned, though, that we're kind of finding ourselves more on the risk-averse side of that too often these days.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying that in the last administration, I had the perhaps dubious honor of overseeing some of our effort to try to leverage our influence with Saudi Arabia to persuade them to, in effect, bomb better. And I can tell you from that experience that it was worth trying. We tried very, very hard over a long period of time, and it had absolutely no impact. It had no impact on their accuracy, in part because accuracy was not the problem. They were very accurate in bombing markets, schools, bridges. In fact, we gave them a list of targets that they were not to strike, and they then proceeded to accurately strike them. And the result is a conflict that, as we've heard, has massively impacted the civilian population and helped Iran. A question has been raised, what influence would we have if we stopped? And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Carlin, you know the full extent of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, how embedded we truly are. It's much more than just targeting assistance. And I wanted to ask you, if we pulled back entirely, including on the assistance that we provide for the servicing of Saudi aircraft, the U.S. government and contractors and private companies, how long could the Saudis actually practically sustain significant air operations over Yemen? Could they go on the offensive for a sustained period of time?
Thank you. While I can't give you an answer in terms of time, I can say that U.S. support is critical to the Saudi effort. Moreover, when you look across the range of U.S. support to the Saudi military, there are a number of different programs, whether it's with the Saudi Navy, the Saudi Air National Guard, it's just, the Saudi National Guard. There's kind of a plethora of programs that permeate the U.S.-Saudi relationship. So when we're talking about pulling back, it's important to think through what do we want to pull back and what do we actually maintain? And to not, none of us want to see it in a binary sense, I think, completely. One of the challenges we do have here is over the last 2 years, we've seen what the new power center in the Crown Prince has kind of, how he's governed, how he's governed Saudi Arabia. And we've seen just a number of extremely problematic decisions domestically and across the region that I think have caused a lot of us to call into question his ability to make the right choice.
Right. It's also been suggested that if we were to pull back in that targeted way, the Saudis could go to other powers, to the Russians, to the Chinese, that they don't actually need American support. Mr. Sullivan, if I could ask you to address that, and specifically perhaps tell us, could the Saudis service F-16s with MiG parts?
It would take, well, the short answer to that question is no, they could not.
If Iran were to start interfering with shipping in the Persian Gulf, would the Chinese Navy come to Saudi Arabia's rescue?
No.
No. Saudi Arabia has an existential interest in maintaining a relationship with the United States. I assume all of you would agree with that.
Yes, and I don't think they can just say, well, we don't need the U.S. because the Russians and Chinese will come fill in the gaps. I do not think they can do that.
Let me also bring up the Khashoggi case, which we haven't really discussed very much here. It's been suggested accurately that there are a lot of human rights problems in Saudi Arabia. Beheadings, journalists are arrested and killed. It's absolutely true. I would argue that this is very different. It's not a human rights issue in Saudi Arabia. This is an example of a country reaching across its borders to kill somebody who had been given protection in the United States, in a democratic country in the Western world. This is not normal. This does not happen frequently in the world. The Russians did it to somebody in England recently. There are very few other examples I can think of. Would you agree that it is a paramount interest of the United States, as a country that is home to thousands of Jamal Khashoggis, people who are in exile from their countries, who are critics of their governments, is it not a paramount interest of the United States to come down extremely hard when something like this happens so that it does not become a norm?
We should absolutely be concerned. And what's sad, to be honest, is that we shouldn't even be that surprised by what happened with Jamal Khashoggi. You had already seen the kidnapping, if you will, of Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri. You had obviously seen all these actions in Yemen. You've seen the arrests of a whole bunch of, frankly, the Crown Prince's relatives in the Ritz-Carlton. So we've seen kind of example after example, the Qatar blockade of just making the wrong choice over and over. And unfortunately, this has been the most spectacular. What worries me the most also is that the Saudi leadership still seems pretty confident. And I think this body has an important role to remind them that we have at least some lines.
Thank you. Well said.
Thank you, Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, if you just push the button.
I'm sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Singh, in your written testimony on page 3, you talk about the fact that there is ongoing disputes between members of the GCC and that has caused limited cooperation. Has that limited cooperation, please tell us how it has impacted the region as a whole?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. I think that the split in the GCC between Qatar on the one hand and Saudis, Emiratis, Egyptians who are outside the GCC on the other hand has been troubling for the United States, because I think we had hoped to forge an alliance between the GCC, other like-minded states in the region, and ourselves to tackle common threats like terrorism, the threats posed by Iran, and so forth. And this dispute has undoubtedly distracted from that. It's also probably arguably led the Qataris into closer relationships with, say, the Iranians, the Chinese, and Russians, and so on and so forth. It is a long-standing dispute, and so we shouldn't be surprised, I think, by it. I think there's a larger problem, though, in the region that this is just one part of, and that's just poor coordination overall. We've seen traditional political groupings like the Arab League diminish in importance and effectiveness. This region has the least economic integration of, I think, any region of the world. And so it's the overall integration, not just militarily, but also diplomatically, economically, which I think limits the effectiveness of, say, these partners to solve problems within their own region.
And then, Mr. Singh, you also said in your written testimony on page 5, you said, in your view, it would be a serious mistake to jettison our partnership with Saudi Arabia or other Gulf allies. Could you expand on that very briefly?
Absolutely. Well, you know, I think that there's two reasons for that. Number one is these alliances we have in the region are not just about accomplishing things through the allies. It's about preventing adverse scenarios, preventing worse outcomes. We want to influence Saudi decision-making so that they make better decisions. That's obviously challenging right now. We want to see stability in these countries. Instability in a place like Saudi Arabia could be devastating for our interests in the region. Over time, I think if we're serious about reallocating resources to other regions of the world, about a great power competition strategy, we will need to work more through allies in this region if we're not going to simply put our interests aside. And so that means that over time we have to turn them into allies like the Israelis, like the Emiratis to some extent, who can act in our stead, in a sense. And so, look, these are the allies we have in the region. If it weren't for difficult partners in the Middle East, we wouldn't really have any partners, would we? And so turning these partnerships into better partnerships needs to be our goal.
And if we were to end this relationship with the Saudis, do you believe that it would damage our ability to influence them as it relates to improving issues such as human rights in their country?
Absolutely.
And then finally, a kind of a follow-up, and I think you touched on this earlier, on page 7 of your written testimony, you say that the withdrawal of U.S. support to the GCC coalition or the suspension of U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia or the UAE are unlikely, to end the conflict or ease humanitarian conditions in Yemen. Do you still feel that way?
I do, yeah. I think it's important to bear in mind that as we have this conversation about our security relationship with the Saudis or with the Emiratis, that is not the same as talking about a strategy to end the conflict, the multiple conflicts in Yemen. If we were to withdraw our support, yes, we might increase the difficulties the Saudis have in sustaining their operations, but I don't believe the conflict would end. I don't believe that the other conflicts in Yemen would improve either. Nor, frankly, do I think we'd absolve ourselves of responsibility for our longstanding involvement in the conflict.
And Mr. Sullivan, as it relates to Mr. Singh's answer to the last question, do you agree or disagree with his assessment?
I agree to the extent that it would not end the conflict, of course. I don't agree that it would have no impact on the conflict. I believe that the threat to reduce or curtail our aid has, over time, made the coalition make different and, in my view, more constructive decisions. At the end of last year, they were more likely to enter the Stockholm Agreement because of what the Senate did. Earlier, CENTCOM withheld certain provision of various types of technologies, minesweepers and other things, and it changed their calculus as respects HODATA. So I do believe the United States deciding to pull back its offensive support to the coalition would have an impact on coalition decision-making that I believe would be positive. And even if it didn't, I would argue we have only contributed to a worse situation by being in, and so we should no longer be in.
Can I just make one point in response to that? Because I don't think we fundamentally disagree, but I think that having that leverage and achieving those outcomes requires that there be some possibility that you'll continue the partnership if they take certain actions. If you just cut the support off, then you don't have that leverage.
And to clarify, I'm not saying cut off the partnership with Saudi Arabia. I'm saying cut off certain systems that they are using and certain assistance that they are using to bomb civilians in Yemen. We have plenty of leverage through the broader security partnership with Saudi Arabia that we can bring to bear in a constructive dialogue with them.
Yeah, I just want to add one point on this. I mean, UAE is actually also quite involved on the Hodeidah operations, and so that's an element that I think that we're missing in this conversation as well. So, you know, if you cut off the relationship with the Saudis, you're also going to cut off the relationship with the UAE over Hodeidah. I don't think that we will, or at a minimum, we need to discuss it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Trone.
Thank you all for coming here today. In your written testimony, Mr. Sullivan, you spoke about actions taken by Saudi Arabia in the last few years, and maybe we could just say, versus Saudi Arabia, say the Crown Prince, regarding destabilization in Yemen. The writs, we'll call it a robbery, extortion, kidnapping in Lebanon, the Prime Minister, the repression throughout Saudi Arabia, kidnapping, etc., the blockade of Qatar, and of course, Khashoggi. What's the most effective thing we could do to help combat, and tell the Crown Prince, enough's enough, we can't keep going down this route, item after item after item?
Well, I think it starts by saying that we are going to need to redefine the terms of this relationship, not to throw it overboard, not to just try to punish Saudi Arabia for the sake of it, but to make sure it aligns better with U.S. interests. So I think you start there. Then you work through each of the issues you just said. With respect to Yemen, as I've proposed, I believe that we should end support for the offensive operations in Yemen and no longer be giving the Crown Prince the support that he has been getting to carry on an operation that is counterproductive to our interests. With respect to the GCC issue and the blockade of Qatar, I think this is something where the United States is going to have to be an honest broker on both sides, but we've got to tell the leadership in Saudi Arabia that this is running counter to U.S. interests as long as it continues. And then with respect to Khashoggi, I believe there needs to be an impartial, independent investigation, and the Saudi investigation is not sufficient. And Secretary Pompeo basically saying it is sufficient, I think, flies in the face of basic logic. There needs to be an independent investigation, and anyone who was complicit in this decision needs to be held accountable.
In December, I was in Israel, and we met with all the various leadership there. And it's certainly crystal clear that they don't want to run from Saudi Arabia. They think if we don't continually, unconditionally support Saudi Arabia, we don't have the block against Iran. But at the end of the day, I take a little different view. I think long term, Crown Prince is 33 years old. We've seen the litany of things that he's accomplished, none of which are good. And the question is, if we don't if we don't stand up, if we don't draw a marker in the sand at some point in time and say enough's enough, we're going to have him as the king for 50 years. So 50 years, we're going to enshrine an individual that is morally bankrupt. It's been an ongoing problem against U.S. interests. So what can or should we be doing to try and think the long view for the next 50 years?
Can I chime in on this, Congressman? I don't know if you're directing that question just to Jake, but I think that the problem we face is that he will be there for 50 years, whether we do those things or not.
But does he have to be there for 50 years, or you just want to accept that?
And I think that it's a false choice between, say, walking away from the alliance or uncritically embracing the leadership in Riyadh. I think the third way, as it were, is a more intensive form of engagement where we try to influence the leadership in Saudi Arabia, supporting the elements of his program that we like, and there are elements of the program
Any of
that
those,
we like.
any of those issues I mentioned you like?
What's that?
Any of those items I mentioned you like?
Well, I think there's things you hinted at that we do like. We like the fact that they're drawing closer to allies like Israel. We like the fact that they're stepping back their support for extremism around the world. Frankly, I think most American officials would say we agree with the need to diversify the Saudi economy, which is part of his agenda. What we don't like are a lot of those foreign policy actions that you saw. But I think, again, the way to influence those things is through intensive engagement. We have no ambassador in Riyadh. We have no Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. We need to get these officials in place. We need to empower them. And then on the Saudi side, we need to try to expand the points of contact in this relationship so that there isn't that kind of single point of failure that I think we have right now.
But should we just accept, Mr. Sullivan, blindly for the next 50 years, this individual running a key ally in the Middle East?
I don't think that we, at the end of the day, are going to be able to dictate who the leader of Saudi Arabia is, but we are going to be able to dictate how we relate to that person, whoever it is. And here, my concern is that the administration has basically decided that it's unconditional support. That's the strategy. And I believe the Congress, therefore, has a deeply critical institutional role to play to provide balance in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Because at the end of the day, I think where Mr. Singh and I do very much agree is we are going to have to find that middle way, which is going to have to involve much more constructive engagement. And this administration does not seem interested in providing that, and therefore I think the Congress has to come forward with a variety of measures to shape this relationship and to send a clear message to the leadership in Saudi Arabia that we are not going to simply accept any and all activities that he's undertaking, including those things that run contrary to our interests and values.
We should also just remember this is not an alliance. It is an insult, frankly, to our European allies, for example, in NATO, or our Asian allies like Japan, when we refer to partnerships as alliances. So I just caution us all. I say this from having spent a lot of time in the Pentagon, where one thinks a lot about what an alliance is and the responsibilities, frankly, that it makes incumbent on the United States.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to thank you. I caught some of your, you were talking at one point about your strong voice against anti-Semitism, and I wanted to thank you for that. I represent a lot of folks that share your views as well as I do on that issue, so I personally thank you for that. And I have a couple of small questions due to my seniority. All of the questions that I'd asked were already asked, so I will not indulge the committee by asking them the fourth or fifth time. But I did notice a great deal of frustration out of the first couple of folks speaking, and it just seemed to me like, what the heck are we doing there? I mean, outside of humanitarian interests, why are we involved? Is it oil? Is it, what is it? If I could just maybe just go down the line and you give me like a 2-sentence answer, if that's possible. Just pretend like all the cameras aren't here.
Yemen or the
you
Arabian
and your
Peninsula?
family.
With respect to Yemen, I mean, there's an enormous set of interests in Yemen. Of course, there's the humanitarian, but there is also the Iranian element of this. There's the free movement of trade, and there's just the strategic nature of the Arabian Peninsula itself. So I wouldn't advocate that we abandon the region or Yemen.
I'd agree. We need to think about freedom of navigation. The U.S. has had a special role in that over decades and decades across the world. We do need to think about energy concerns. And then, frankly, we need to think about containment. Vegas rules, unfortunately, do not apply to the Middle East. Who would have thought that a conflict in Syria would have resulted in actually throwing apart the integrity of the European Union? So we need to play a role. However, we need to recognize the opportunity costs of our involvement in this region are only getting higher and higher.
Well, I think with respect to Yemen specifically, the way the United States got engaged in this conflict as an indirect participant is because Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Arab countries decided that it represented a direct threat to them. And we decided we were going to work with them to try to respond to that threat. The issue that I've consistently tried to raise over the course of this hearing is I think now with going on 4 years of experience under our belt in trying to help them, the course that we have taken has made things worse, not better, and therefore we should change course.
I don't have a lot to add to that, Congressman. I just want to point out something which has already been said, that of course we also do have a direct engagement in Yemen to counter al-Qaeda and to counter ISIS, and I think it's important we not lose sight of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today, and I agree that I have, at this point, few questions to ask that are unique, but some to follow up on. And I guess my first follow-up is a conversation that Representative Pence started to have, which has to do with what can Congress do, what are the powers and the authorities of Congress in a situation like this. And I guess what I'd like to ask, and I think Dr. Carlin, based on our conversation so far, I think you might be the first person who can answer this, which is if we can go way back into the Obama administration and we talk about the original decision to begin things like refueling and other sorts of support for the Saudi coalition, what do you think that that administration saw? What was their thinking or their mindset at the time that deemed it necessary and appropriate at that time to go in the way that we did without the authority and the authorization of Congress?
Thank you. While I was not a part of that discussion, my assumption is the thought process was that the Saudis are a close partner that are very helpful for a number of regional concerns. They're getting involved in a conflict, and we have a lot of experience with these sorts of things. So we should see what effect our help can have. So I think, as Mr. Sullivan has discussed previously, I think it was a good faith effort to see how we could help them really use their military force for one of the first few times they had done that in a meaningful way. Where Congress, I think, can be especially helpful is forcing something that Mr. Singh suggested earlier, forcing that step back, forcing that assessment and saying, okay, it's been a couple years. What effect have we had? What effect should we have expected to have? And what are the costs?
And I agree with you because his conversation also talked a little bit about the responsibility of Congress having a longer-term view and making sure that we're thinking hard about why we are places that we are and whether we should stay there. And it just feels as though we're in this place right now where we made a decision, and even with your description, didn't sound like a decision that was imminent or pressing or needed some sort of a step around Congress. Here we are, and now we're kind of have the opportunity to step back and look at it. So you don't see that there's anything now that would continue to require that there not be an authorization on the part of Congress to continue to be involved in this area.
I think Congress's involvement is crucial. It is really hard to step back and assess how well the policy you're working on is actually working or having the effect you want. And I think for this committee writ large, the U.S. The executive branch and the military in particular has focused largely on this region for the last 18 years. It is going to be extra hard then for any administration to feel comfortable stepping back and saying, what have we achieved and what haven't we achieved? That's an uncomfortable and awkward and yet crucial discussion that this committee can really help facilitate.
Thank you, and I really do agree. I don't think it's necessarily about one administration or the other, but really a question of whether or not this body, this Congress, should also be involved in that decision of whether or not to appropriate these kinds of resources. My second question, if I have time, is probably for Mr. Sullivan. You spoke really eloquently several times about the fact that we should have a bipartisan and very serious conversation about a sustainable relationship ongoing. You did speak about ideas like curtailing logistical support, about disrupting maritime lines, and you also spoke about finding a political solution and your hope that there was something there. Dr. Carlin, you also spoke about efforts that the military efforts and the diplomatic efforts in many cases are at odds with one another and acting counter to one another right now. So here we are years later, and whatever we're doing isn't working. So if we end up sort of pulling back one aspect, maybe the offensive engagement that we have right now, if you can envision not militarily what the consequences will be, because we talked about that over here, but in terms of energy, commerce, all the other sorts of implications about our relationship with Saudi Arabia, what can you imagine or speculate would happen if we ended up offensively pulling out of our relationship right now?
Do you mean pulling out altogether, saying sort of breaching the relationship more fundamentally, or just with respect to Yemen?
Just with respect to Yemen, exactly.
Look, I believe that we put in a good faith effort to support and provide assistance to this coalition effort over an extended period of time. And we can make a good faith case to our partners that we are done because we don't think it's working, and frankly, it's shocking our conscience what's happening as a result of this. And I do not believe that that needs to or would lead to a fundamental breach or disruption in our relationship, and that the positive elements of that relationship could continue even if the United States no longer participated in this, and that would be the policy I would aim for.
I appreciate your time very much, and I yield back the remainder of my time to the chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reschenthaler.
To this, thanks. I thought I had it. Thank you, Greg. I just want to express my gratitude for being appointed to this committee, and I look forward to working to ensure America's continued leadership on the world stage. So having served in Iraq, I know firsthand the challenges facing our counterparts in the Middle East and the escalating sensitivity of the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen is devastated by violence and human rights atrocities, as you've discussed today. It is estimated that 80% of the Yemeni population needs humanitarian assistance. 17.8 million civilians are food insecure, and approximately 60,000 people have been killed since January 2016. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen must be addressed immediately. However, continued calls for the United States to withdraw security assistance from the Arabian Peninsula because of this crisis would be a serious mistake. Iran, the world's largest sponsor of terror, has been illegally supplying Houthi rebels in Yemen with missiles, training, and support in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. The Houthis use these illegal arms transfer to terrorize American allies and counterparts, targeting Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, as well as civilian aircraft in the region. Just this past January, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates testified that al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen, AQAP, remains one of the largest and most capable terror groups in the region. This is why I fully support continued U.S. security assistance and the administration's goal to create the Middle East Security Alliance, a regional NATO-like body that will deepen cooperation on missile defense, military training, counterterrorism, and strengthening regional and economic diplomatic ties. I strongly support the U.S. working in coordination with our counterparts in the Gulf region. However, cooperation shared goals do not equate to blind allegiance and obedience. The assassination of Jamal Khashoggi and detention of women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia do not align with the values of the United States and deserve scrutiny. However, holding others accountable should not come at the expense of the safety and security of the American people. Following this hearing, this committee will consider a resolution directing the removal of U.S. security assistance in the Arabian Peninsula. This resolution is misguided and based on a false premise. It does nothing but open the door for rogue actors like Iran, China, and Russia to gain a stronger foothold in one of the most turbulent regions in the world and continue to sow further chaos. So with that, Mr. Singh, what are the core functions, in your opinion, of the Saudi-U.S. relationship, and what other interests in the Middle East does this relationship support?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think you made a lot of excellent points there. Look, the U.S.-Saudi relationship is one of our major relationships, obviously, in this part of the world. It's obviously not the only one. The U.S.-UAE relationship has been discussed here. We have relations with the Bahrainis, the Kuwaitis, and others who are engaged in some of these conflicts. Our interests in the Middle East are, I think, quite compelling and of concern to ordinary Americans. Things like counterterrorism, preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, ensuring the free flow of energy and commerce, and ensuring freedom of action for American forces. As you know, Congressman, our military facilities in the Gulf are used not just to prosecute conflicts or wars or operations within this region, but elsewhere, to project power outside of this region. These allies, like the Saudis, the Emiratis, and so forth, are key partners in all of those efforts. Our counterterrorism relations with the Saudis are good, and with the Emiratis are good. And frankly, we would suffer if we didn't have their cooperation. They would suffer if they didn't have our cooperation. It's mutually beneficial. I think that, again, the question is, can we turn these relationships into something more? And the example of Yemen, the example of Syria is discouraging and suggests the need for a lot more work and engagement, maybe a rethinking of how we're doing our military partnerships, how we're conducting our military partnerships. And I think it's absolutely appropriate to explore that, but I think that's very different from saying, let's disengage or walk away or withdraw our assistance.
Mr. Singh, if we did withdraw, who do you think would fill that power vacuum? How would you see that playing out?
I think as the U.S. steps back, look, there are other great powers, other external powers, let's say, who have also interest in this region. The Russians have an interest in the region. The Chinese have an interest in this region. And whether they wanted to or not, I think as the U.S. steps back, it increases the incentive for them to increase their involvement in the region. Already, for example, the Saudis have a tremendous economic relationship with the Chinese. I think if the U.S. stepped back, they would need to look to diversify their external relationships.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to first thank our distinguished witnesses for coming to testify. Thank you so much for taking the time. This Saudi-led coalition has engaged in a military action in Yemen for a little over 3 years now, and the ongoing military campaign has triggered one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. In the last 3.5 years, more than 17,000 people have been killed and another 40,000 wounded. A further 3 million have been internally displaced, and according to USAID, 22.2 million Yemenis, or 3/4 of the Yemeni population, need humanitarian assistance. Millions are on the verge of starvation. There's a cholera outbreak that's tied to the Saudi-led war that has erupted in 21 of Yemen's 22 provinces, infecting approximately 1 million Yemenis, making it one of the worst cholera outbreaks in our history. And I know that we are having a conversation about, what our interests are, but I want us to root this conversation in the interest of protecting human life and furthering our values of protecting human life. I agree with my colleague, Mr. Berry, that we have known for years about Saudi brutality and its atrocity record of human rights, women's rights, and religious freedom. Where I strongly disagree is that we should have even tolerate this type of behavior from an ally. As Chairman Engel noted earlier, there's also evidence that the coalition of arming the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula linked fighters in Yemen, directly undercutting our military's objective there. There's also far from the first time the Saudis have supported and enabled jihadis. My concern is about the way our support for the Saudi, in spite of these clear contradictions with our values and our interests, are affecting our diplomatic credibility in the region. When we see other members of that region, like Iran, commit human rights atrocities or are engaging in activities that are destabilizing the region, we are quick to condemn them and call them out. So my question is to Mr. Sullivan. In your answer to Mr. Levin's question earlier, you said human rights needs to be at a higher priority. Can you explain why that is?
In a number of our significant relationships around the world, including the U.S.-Saudi relationship, we sometimes have to make decisions about what we're placing paramount priority on in terms of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And there are instances throughout Democratic and Republican administrations where human rights take a backseat to short-term security interest concerns. That has happened in the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administrations. It's happening with much more frequency in the Trump administration. The issue I see with Saudi Arabia is that we have allowed that to become so embedded in our muscle memory in the relationship that we basically don't really press on human rights concerns much at all. And particularly with the current president essentially saying, I don't care about those issues, do as you please. I think this has reached a point where it's no longer sustainable for the United States, and that we have to find a way consistent with the complexity of our interests in the region to elevate the dialogue and discourse and urgency of our demands of our partners that they do better when it comes to how they treat their citizens.
And do you think this double standard is impacting our diplomatic credibility in the region?
I think it's a broader issue with U.S. foreign policy. Anytime you are both engaged in power politics in the world and you are trying to advance values, as the United States does, you are going to have certain instances of inconsistency and hypocrisy. That is built into a unique attribute of American policy, which is we do care about these issues the way a lot of other countries don't. And so necessarily sometimes there will be inconsistency. I don't think that has to undermine our credibility, but it does mean we have to be more forthright and honest about it and do a better job of making sure that we're not simply ignoring human rights issues, I think, as we all too often have done in this relationship. Again, in a bipartisan way. I'm not trying to use this as a political cudgel just against this administration.
Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Wagner.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member for organizing this hearing, and thank our witnesses for being here. Our Gulf partners have proven invaluable in opposing Iran's destabilizing agenda, fighting terrorism, and recognizing Israel's right to exist. And I believe we must continue holding our allies to a high ethical and humanitarian standard. I appreciate the opportunity to learn more about U.S. efforts to prevent civilian casualties and foster respect for human rights in the Arabian Peninsula. When Canada's foreign minister criticized egregious human rights abuses, the Saudi government expelled the Canadian ambassador, withdrew its own ambassador to Canada, and froze pending trade and investment deals. The Saudis have engaged in similar disputes with Germany and I believe Sweden also. Mr. Singh, are Canada, Germany, and Sweden coordinating a response to the latest diplomatic feud, and how can we support our Canadian partners?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I don't know that they are coordinating a response. If so, it's not something I've heard about. But I do think that the episode you cite is an example of the kind of, frankly, reckless actions by the Saudis that are concerning to us, that are troubling to us, because it was a valid criticism, and the Saudi response was, in my view, totally out of proportion to what the Canadians had done. I would have liked to see us back up our Canadian allies in their criticism of the Saudis, because I don't think, this goes to what Mr. Sullivan was saying, I don't think it's good for us, or frankly good for the Saudis, that they feel as though they can kind of intimidate other countries into not criticizing them. Look, from my point of view, this is not just a matter of values or morals, or those things are important. When human rights abuses are allowed to go forward unchecked, I think it also endangers the stability of these countries and encourages extremism.
Thank you. Increasing access to affordable food, fuel, and medicine is key to restoring stability in Yemen. But Houthi rebels have disrupted the movement of imports by targeting commercial and military vessels transiting the Red Sea, and Saudi Arabia has imposed periodic blockades. Dr. Carlin, how can the international community support freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and facilitate the movement of necessities to Yemeni ports?
Thank you for that question. I think the U.S. Military can be helpful, as can regional militaries, in facilitating freedom of navigation through these areas, whether it's assisting in transporting, whether it's helping regional navies through exercising by showing them how they might responsibly operate in that area. all of which can be useful.
Mr. Singh, preventing civilian casualties in the Yemen conflict is a primary goal of the U.S.-Saudi military cooperation. Can you describe how the United States is working with the coalition to end the killing of civilians? How effective have these efforts been?
Well, Congresswoman, obviously this is, I think, a top concern for our military officials and also our diplomatic officials who are dealing with this issue. As has been discussed here a little bit, we've done a number of things. One is by providing precision munitions to our allies. We have, especially in the wake of particular incidents, worked on the training of pilots. We've tried to help the Saudis in terms of investigating incidents to determine exactly what occurred. And we've also worked with them on questions of intelligence and these sort of do not target lists and so forth. As far as I understand it, and obviously you'd want a full briefing from our military officials, that's what we have done. I think that my impression is that I haven't heard any U.S. officials, let's put it that way, say that they feel as though the Saudis are deliberately targeting civilians. If we felt that way, I think we would have to end our cooperation with them. But I think we need to appreciate that the level of care and precision that the U.S. military brings to these conflicts is simply, frankly, unmatched almost anywhere else in the world. And that's why these kinds of long-term efforts at bringing up the abilities and capabilities of our allies is so important.
Mr. Sullivan, UN agencies and international NGOs are struggling to access areas in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. How can we work with our allies to do more to increase access for the UN and international NGOs? And any points of leverage that can be used to achieve this with the Saudis and the Emirates?
I defer to the expertise of Mr. Hardin, who I think has made a couple of really important points today. One is that a lot of this rests with the Houthis, over whom we don't have influence, but who we should be sure to be shining a spotlight on the extent to which they are blocking access through Hudaydah. But with the Saudis and Emiratis, I do think that we have influence and leverage both to open corridors across the Saudi border, as Mr. Hardin said earlier, and in respect to the Stockholm Agreement, which is fragile and sort of quasi-holding, working to restrain the Saudis and Emiratis so that more channels coming out of Hudaydah can be opened beyond basically the one road that's coming out right now. So those are available to us, but it's an imperfect set of tools because so much of this rests on making sure the Houthis step up to do their part.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to first just follow up on Congressman Omar's questioning about where human rights fits into our foreign policy. And Mr. Sullivan, when you said that, you talked about power politics and advancing values and the need for inconsistency when using power politics and advancing values. Obviously, the suggestion being that there is always, or if not always, certainly many times where those two things are inconsistent. Can I ask, you started talking about the ways that we can use our leverage. Isn't advancing our values, isn't standing up for human rights, doesn't that actually give us more power? Doesn't that, when we engage in power politics, making clear what it is that motivates us, strengthens us as we confront the difficult issues and sometimes difficult challenges in governments that we deal with?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to potentially clarify, because it sounds like I may have not made myself clear. I'm not arguing that the United States should not be standing up in a consistent and resolute way for human rights. Indeed, I said in my earlier answer to Congresswoman Omar that there's something unique and special about the United States in this regard, and we need to work desperately to hold on to that. What I'm saying is that in a complex world where we have a range of interests with any given country, there are necessarily going to be times where standing up for human rights is not going to be the only issue on the agenda. And just to give an example, when the street protests began in Bahrain, and Bahraini activists came to us and said, essentially, support us over a government who is repressing us, we had to think very hard about the fact that the Fifth Fleet is headquartered in Manama. That was a factor in our decision-making. Now, I would say at the macro level, long-term, there is nothing inconsistent between our interests and our values. They converge. But in the short term, there are going to be times where we do business with countries with whom we radically disagree, where we have partnerships with countries who do not share our values. And in that, I think we just have to get more, I think, forthright and honest about the extent to which these are sometimes difficult circumstances. And the problem I see in the Saudi relationship is we have allowed that thinking to go to its extreme to the point where we really don't treat human rights as a key feature of the relationship at all. That's my view.
So sticking with the Saudi relationship, when you say that we may overestimate our leverage, I know there's been a lot of discussion about weapon sales. What other leverage do we have? And getting back to the power politics and advancing values, in an instance where a journalist is murdered and decapitated, how does speaking out forcefully against that and demanding accountability and looking for ways to ensure that there is accountability, how does that interfere with the power politics that are very much in play?
Well, you know, this is a great example of where there's a vigorous debate, and many in the administration are very much on the other side of this debate, basically saying if we push too hard on the Khashoggi issue, we're going to lose Saudi Arabia, and that will come at a cost to our larger interests in the world. Now, I happen to radically disagree with that, both because I think we have much more leverage in this relationship than the Saudis do, and because, as others have said on the panel, at some point you reach a breaking point. And the wanton murder of somebody who was under U.S. protection, was a resident of the United States in a foreign embassy, is well past that breaking point in my view. So the argument I'm making is that it is not enough to simply say we stand for human rights and that's great. It's to problematize this issue. It's to stare it square in the face. It's to say oftentimes we say that and then we don't really do it. And more with respect to Saudi Arabia, we should be doing it.
And so play that out then. So again, other than weapon sales, or in addition to weapon sales, what is the leverage that we should be looking to utilize?
One thing that we've done so far, of course, is under Global Magnitsky, we've sanctioned 17 Saudi nationals who we believe were engaged in this. But I think we should take an additional step of demanding an independent, impartial, international investigation, and whomever is determined to have played a role in this or been responsible or directed this should equally be held accountable under United States law.
Thanks, Mr. Sullivan. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being here.
Thank you. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Getting the U.S. out of Yemen is not and should not be a partisan issue. I and other Democrats and Republicans in 2015 started criticizing the Obama administration. We wrote letters, we did press conferences, we introduced legislation. And it wasn't just a humanitarian catastrophe that was happening. One of the primary drivers was war crimes. And as a result of the pressure, the Obama administration, in fact, took action. So, Mr. Sullivan, it's correct, isn't it, that the Obama administration actually stopped a shipment of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia?
Yes, they did, and then it was restarted
under the Trump administration.
Right.
Now, the reason the Obama administration stopped that shipment is they did a review, and they figured out it wasn't the case that the Saudis were trying to hit some moving Houthi truck, missed, and then hit a funeral. What in fact happened is they very precisely intended to hit the targets that they hit. They struck schools, they struck hospitals, they struck wedding parties, they struck civilian markets, and then they struck a funeral that had that killed hundreds and injured hundreds of people, and then the jets came around, struck the same funeral again. So Obama figured out that in fact, precision-guided munitions were killing more civilians than if they were not precision-guided. And is that one of the reasons they decided to stop that shipment, Mr. Sullivan?
Yes.
Okay. So, Mr. Singh, I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk because I disagree with what you said, and you did give testimony that somehow precision-guided munitions would cause less civilian casualties. It looks like it's the opposite, especially because if you just look at what happened a few months ago, the Saudis very precisely struck a school bus, killing over 40 children, and then they admitted they intended to hit that bus. So if you'd like to comment, Mr. Singh.
Well, Congressman, I can't, obviously, I'm not a military official or privy to the intelligence that you're privy to. All I can tell you is that when I have asked U.S. officials these questions, they have suggested to me that they feel the problem is a question of competence and ability as opposed to a question of intent on the part of our partners. But I think it's, frankly, Congressman, a question you should be asking the administration rather than me, because I don't have that information.
Right. I'm not asking you. You have made a statement to a colleague of mine that somehow precision-guided munitions would somehow cause less casualties.
That is generally the belief,
Right.
Congressman. That's why we use precision-guided munitions, because they reduce civilian
Correct.
casualties.
Right.
And if you compare Yemen to Syria, I think you can see that very clearly.
Right.
But the specific question as to the targeting and intent of our allies, I have to refer you to our military officials.
Thank you. And so my only point is, they reduce civilian casualties if the civilians weren't in fact targeted. So that's a problem, right? The Saudis are in fact targeting civilians. How do we know? They admit it. They admitted publicly they intended to strike that bus. So I would suggest that the U.S. officials you're talking to are in fact lying, because just based on public Saudi statements, that's why I wrote a letter to the Department of Defense Inspector General to investigate whether DoD personnel or other personnel are complicit in war crimes. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Sullivan, it's true, right, that both international law as well as regulations and domestic law prevent U.S. personnel from engaging in war crimes?
Yes, of course.
Right. And then you can't actually aid someone that you know was committing war crimes as well, isn't that right?
Correct.
Okay. So let me now move to a related but separate area. Public reporting is that the Crown Prince had bragged that Jared Kushner was in his back pocket. We also know that based on this reporting, Jared Kushner made an unannounced trip to Riyadh, catching some intelligence officials off guard. This was not a trip that he had disclosed to anyone. And then we see sort of this complete kowtowing to Saudi Arabia by Donald Trump and the administration. So, Mr. Sullivan, any other members on the panel, just want to get your thoughts on whether you think it's that they just happen to think Saudi Arabia has a bunch of money and oil, or is there something more nefarious going on?
I think there are sufficient legitimate questions about the potential business interests of both the Trump organization and Trump family and the Kushner family with respect to the Gulf and Saudi Arabia in particular that it demands more investigation. But we can't jump to conclusions on that. That's something the Congress could take up.
Thank you. Let me thank Chairman Engo for creating a subcommittee of oversight on the Foreign Affairs Committee to do exactly that, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Costa.
Thank you, Chairman. And I think I'm the last one, so most of the questions have been
Well,
asked.
actually, Mr. Castro,
There's somebody
Mr.
else?
Costa came, so I'm going to
All
call on
right,
him,
Jim.
and then you'll truly be the last one.
All right.
Okay,
Jim.
Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, the ranking member. It's good to be back on the Foreign Affairs Committee. We've had a very impressive group of witnesses testify today, and I apologize with other committee hearings. I've been in and out of the meetings, so I obviously haven't been able to track all of the questions and your comments. And I apologize if this question's been asked already, but in the event that this resolution that comes up, and as we look at our ability to try to develop some renewed effort, and this committee's been good at it, generally speaking, on bipartisan agreements on issues affecting our country on off the water's edge. But what do you think are the likely consequences of passing this resolution today, and the impacts as we go ahead to try to put some borders in terms of a foreign policy in this country that has continuity and that reflects a tradition that has existed through past administrations, both Democratic and Republican, that protects and reflects the alliances that have been crucial post-World War II to the world we live in today. And I'd like, in that context, to get your thoughts on, because I think obviously there are going to be future resolutions that we will be acting on that will come to us as we try to provide some sidewalls, I guess, for a better term, in terms of this zigzagging or ricocheting of a foreign policy that many of us perceive has taken place over the last 2 years.
So I would start by saying that the first thing that this can do is actually much beyond just Yemen. It's to something that was built into your question, which is it is the assertion of Congress that it has an important bipartisan role to play in the participation of the United States in military activities across the Middle East and across the world. And that is relevant to a series of questions that have not really been visited by the Congress since the passage of the resolutions in 2001 to use military force in 2001 and 2002. So I think it'd be a big step forward in terms of the assertion of this body that it is going to be a fundamental part of the conversation about the balance of U.S. interest in the region and where military force and activity is appropriate and where it is not. I also think it will send a message to the international community and to the participants in this conflict that the United States is not simply going to allow business as usual to continue. And I think the Senate passing the resolution last year did have some effect on the calculus of the Saudi-led coalition. I don't think it will impact the Trump administration. I think they will conclude that they can continue their activities uninhibited, but I think it will have those two effects.
But I think it certainly provides an illustration of what we think the importance of a well-thought-out foreign policy and not one based on tweets, as you said in your earlier comments today, that is unprecedented, I think, with any previous administrations. The fact is that we should assert ourselves. Congress in recent years has abdicated its role to a large extent, I think. And clearly, there are other issues. Many of us work with our European allies. They're very concerned and wondering what our policy is on any given day. Would some of the others of you care to comment?
You know, I have to say, Congressman, that I don't fully agree with Mr. Sullivan on this point. I am a strong believer in congressional oversight of the executive branch. Having only worked in the executive branch myself, I think Congress plays an important role. I don't think, though, that it's right to say that the types of support we're offering to our partners, the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, constitute hostilities, if this is the question before the committee. And I worry about the precedent that would set for our ability to support partners around the world. We want other states, in general, to step forward and take some of the burden off the United States. And we see partners in some parts of the world doing that. The French are active, for example, in the Sahel in Africa. In exigencies, you know, if there were, for example, a war between Israel and Iran, we want to be able to provide certain types of assistance below the level.
It depends upon how that policy is pursued and its impacts and the effects of it, and whether, I mean, sometimes we support a policy and it doesn't turn out the way we had hoped it would.
That's absolutely true. I would just be careful. I would advise caution on terms of the precedent that's being set.
We need to be cognizant our partners have some warts, no doubt. The most effective U.S. policy is one that blends carrots and sticks. I think what we've seen from this administration so far has been all carrots vis-a-vis the Saudis, and that's problematic. And Congress can be helpful in shining a light on many of the warts. You know, Mr. Sullivan, I think, clearly articulated that there are a number of times where the U.S., for various reasons, ends up making compromises. It's important that we're sober and clear-eyed about when we're making those compromises. And it is worth reminding ourselves, of course, that the Houthis do not pose a transnational threat to U.S. national security. If this were a conversation about Hezbollah, I would have a very different response, and I suspect many of us would as well. But a reminder that U.S. assistance comes with some sticks is crucial. And there are various ways one might exert that.
So I just want to note that the role of Congress at the Foreign Service level in embassies and at the diplomatic exchanges has a very profound impact on how we shape our conversation and the points that we push. So we should never minimize that. Secondly, I would associate myself with Mr. Singh in the sense that the oversight role of Congress is extraordinarily important, but the narrow question as to whether or not these activities constitute hostilities, I think, may be beyond what the goal is in terms of carving back actual hostile actions by the administration.
Thank you very much. And now we go to Mr. Castro, this time last but certainly not least.
Thank you. I was going to say earlier that I had 3 committee hearings at the same time, so I think most of the questions have been asked already. But let me ask y'all, and whoever wants to answer it, whether you think MBS is a rogue or a reformer, based on what you've seen so far.
I think it's not binary. I think you can.
Well, what is he?
I don't think that's too crass of a choice, I think.
No, I know. You said it's non-binary. What is he?
I think he could be a reformer who is also acting in authoritarian ways that is counterproductive at times. So both.
We've seen evidence that he's taken steps in both directions, and I think we should recognize those steps. Yes, he has made progress in terms of opening up Saudi Arabia, women driving, all of that, the economy piece, great. He's also taken a number of really irresponsible steps, as we've discussed a bit here, whether it's arresting folks in the Ritz-Carlton, the Hariri hostage-taking, if you will, or kidnapping, obviously the blockade against Qatar, the Jamal Khashoggi affair, the war in Yemen, and so he is, on one level, stumbling in really key and worrisome ways. On another level, is taking some steps that are meaningful. When you go to Saudi Arabia, it's a little bit different than it was when you went 10 years ago. So figuring out how to sort of tame his worst instincts, of which I think they are profound, and I can't kind of underscore that enough, while trying to elevate the handful of right steps he's making is important.
And Dr. Carlin, you mentioned in your last comment that with respect to the Trump administration, it's been mostly carrots with respect to Saudi Arabia, and that there have been really no sticks. What sticks would you apply to Saudi Arabia?
I would encourage investigations. So mandating, say, that there needs to be an investigation into the Khashoggi affair and an actual independent one, not one that's coming, obviously, from the leadership. I would look at tightening the U.S. security cooperation more broadly with the Saudis. And I would not underestimate the significance of just verbal articulation of what's wrong. People hear that, people know that, and it should start to worry them. If the leadership in Riyadh is only hearing kind of positive endorsements from the administration, it's crucial that that gets balanced by Congress emphasizing that there are things that are right and things that are wrong.
Can I just say, I don't really agree with the characterization of the Trump administration's policy in the sense that
which part? That there have been no sticks?
That there have been no sticks. I mean, we have seen 17 Saudis sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act as a result of the Khashoggi assassination. Sanctioning members of allied governments is a significant step. I think we need to acknowledge that. We've also seen the Trump administration, partly I think in response to pressure from Congress, suspend the mid-air refueling for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And also I think my understanding is that Secretary Pompeo in his private meetings with the Saudis has delivered messages on some of these issues, with the women's rights activists, Khashoggi, the war in Yemen. I think publicly they have been quite supportive.
Do you think we've done enough in response to Khashoggi and the situation in Yemen?
I think, Congressman, that what we need is much more engagement with the Saudis at multiple levels. My concern is that right now, this relationship is in the hands of too few individuals on both sides. I'd like to see us have...
You mean Jared Kushner?
What's that?
Jared Kushner?
I think on both sides, it's in too few hands. We have no ambassador in Riyadh. The Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs nomination is held up right now, and I think that this relationship will only be healthier when we're able to broaden it and diversify it in that way, and it'll involve both carrots and sticks, and I think sometimes it's appropriate that it'll involve tough private messages, but some public support.
Jake?
I do not have confidence presently that there is a huge difference between the private messages we're sending the Saudis and what we're hearing publicly. I've not seen evidence of that. I don't see any sense in which the leadership of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince right now feel that they are under any meaningful pressure from this administration. And I do think we need to take further steps in response to the Khashoggi affair, that it is not sufficient, the 17.
I think part of the difficult part of that is that the president really sidelines all of his advisors. I don't think there's anybody that can reliably speak for the president, including the vice president. Most notably, when he came to Congress to cut a budget deal, and on his way back to the White House, it was undone. I think that makes it even more difficult because it's hard enough for Americans to read the president, American politicians. I suspect it's even harder for folks who are overseas. I yield back.
Thank you. This concludes our hearing. Let me first announce how we're going to work this. First, I want to thank the witnesses for outstanding testimony. And when you signed up for this, I know you didn't think it was going to be this long. But as you can tell, we had very thoughtful members from both sides who really had a lot of good questions to ask. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody has as well. So we're going to give you a couple of minutes to leave, and want to thank you again. And then we will conclude. We will begin the markup immediately after, say, in a minute or two. I want to thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman.
What we're going to do is begin our markup shortly and return after floor votes to conclude the markup. There is going to be floor votes at what time? Now, momentarily. And so the hearing is now adjourned, and in a minute or so, we're going to start the next phase. And Mr. McCall and I are going to start with our opening statements, and then we're going to have everybody come back to make remarks after the votes and to vote after the votes.